When the FA-18 Super Hornet suddenly took off from Pensacola Base without orders, no one suspected that the pilot inside was a woman who had been dead for 8 years. This story isn't just about stolen honor, but about a corruption conspiracy buried since the Persian Gulf War, a secret that could shake the entire American defense system. Comment below. Do you believe the truth always comes to light? I promise this story will change how you see loyalty and courage. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 8 years. Sarah Mitchell rolled out of the narrow bed in her single-wide trailer, her feet hitting the cold linoleum floor with practiced silence. At 42, her body still carried the lean muscle memory of a fighter pilot, though her calloused hands now bore the permanent stains of hydraulic fluid and engine grease instead of the smooth leather of flight gloves. She dressed in the darkness, pulling on worn Carhartt coveralls that hung loose on her frame. The woman staring back from the cracked bathroom mirror bore little resemblance to the officer who once graced the covers of Aviation Week and Naval Institute proceedings. Sarah Mitchell, aircraft maintenance supervisor at Pensacola Naval Air Station, was a ghost, a deliberately constructed phantom who had spent 8 years perfecting the art of invisibility. The trailer park sat on the forgotten edge of Escambia County, where old Florida still whispered through Spanish moss and crumbling concrete. Her neighbors were mostly retirees, disability checks, and the occasional oil rig worker rotating through. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked too close. Nobody knew that the quiet woman in Lot 47 had once been Lieutenant Commander Catherine "Cat" Sullivan, the first and only female pilot to successfully execute the legendary Miracle of Mobile Bay, a feat of flying that saved 400 souls from an environmental disaster and earned her the Navy Cross. That was before the accident, before the court-martial, before the world learned that America's newest aviation hero was supposedly a traitor who sold classified flight data to foreign agents, before she died. Sarah's morning routine never varied. Coffee, first black, strong enough to wake the dead. Then the 5-mile run that took her past the Pensacola National Cemetery, where weathered headstones marked the resting places of sailors, Marines, and aviators who had served their country across 2 centuries of American military history. She always slowed at one particular grave in Section 42, where a simple white marble marker read, Catherine Elizabeth Sullivan, Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy, 1982-2016. She gave her life in service to freedom. The epitaph was a lie. Catherine Sullivan hadn't died in 2016. She had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a carefully constructed identity that could survive background checks, employment, verification, and the casual scrutiny of a life lived deliberately below the radar. The woman buried in that grave was a Jane Doe from the county morgue, a victim of bureaucratic convenience and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of naval command. Sarah finished her run as the sun painted the Gulf of Mexico in shades of amber and rose. Pensacola Naval Air Station stretched along the waterfront like a sleeping giant, its runways and hangars holding secrets that spanned from the Wright brothers to the Space Shuttle program. This was the birthplace of naval aviation, where young men and women learned to defy gravity in service of their country. It was also where careers were made and destroyed, where loyalty was tested, and where the truth sometimes became a casualty of larger political games. The base entrance buzzed with morning activity as Sarah showed her contractor's ID to the young Marine at the security checkpoint. He barely glanced at her face, seeing only another civilian maintenance worker reporting for another ordinary day. If he had looked closer, if he had studied her eyes, he might have recognized something that didn't belong in a hydraulics specialist, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen combat from 30,000 feet, the subtle alertness of a predator scanning for threats. but nobody looked that close at Sarah Mitchell. Hangar 7 housed the maintenance operations for visiting aircraft, a massive cathedral of steel and concrete that echoed with the sound of pneumatic tools and shouted instructions. Sarah's team was responsible for everything that flew through Pensacola, on temporary assignment Coast Guard helicopters, Air Force transports, and occasionally the sleek blue and gold fighters of the Navy's Flight Demonstration Squadron. The Blue Angels. Sarah had been avoiding that particular assignment for 8 years, finding excuses whenever the famous squadron visited her old home base. But luck, it seemed, had finally run out. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tank Rodriguez found her beneath the engine cowling of a Coast Guard Jayhawk, her practiced hands checking hydraulic connections that lesser mechanics might miss. Rodriguez was old-school Navy, 30 years of keeping aircraft flying in conditions that would challenge a video game programmer's imagination. He approached with the measured gait of a man who had learned that maintenance supervisors were either geniuses or disasters with very little middle ground. "Mitchell!" he called out, his voice cutting through the hangar noise. "Got a situation developing." Sarah extracted herself from the helicopter's engine compartment, wiping her hands on a rag that had seen better decades. She studied Rodriguez's expression, reading the mix of excitement and apprehension that usually accompanied high-profile assignments. "What kind of situation, Chief?" "Gulf Coast Thunder," Rodriguez said, referring to the massive air show scheduled for the following month. Biggest aviation exhibition in the Southeast, marking the 80th anniversary of the Blue Angels. We're talking 50,000 people, international media, and every military aviation unit worth mentioning. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And your team's been tagged for Blue Angels support. Full maintenance coordination, pre-flight inspections, ground handling for their A-18 Super Hornets." Rodriguez paused, studying her reaction. "Problem is, these guys are particular. Real particular. They'll want their own maintenance chief liaison, someone who knows Super Hornets inside and out." The irony was almost painful. Sarah probably knew more about FA-18 systems than anyone currently wearing a Blue Angels uniform. She had helped write some of the technical manuals they studied, had pushed those aircraft to their absolute limits in ways that demonstration flying never demanded. But Sarah Mitchell, maintenance supervisor, was supposed to be impressed by the assignment, maybe even a little intimidated. "When do they arrive?" she asked. 3 days. Squadron commander is Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson. Kid's got quite a reputation, youngest pilot ever selected for the team, son of a Medal of Honor recipient. Rodriguez's expression shifted slightly. "Word is his old man was killed in action during some classified operation back in '16. Kid's been carrying that weight his whole career." Sarah's hands stopped moving entirely. 2016. The same year Catherine Sullivan had died. The same year that everything she had worked for, everything she believed in, had been destroyed by lies and betrayal and the cold calculation of men who put politics above truth. "You all right, Mitchell?" Rodriguez asked, noticing her sudden stillness. "Fine, Chief. Just thinking through the logistics." She forced her voice to remain steady. "Blue Angels have specific ground handling procedures. I'll need to review the updated protocols." What she didn't mention was that she had written many of those protocols herself, back when she wore the blue and gold flight suit, and her every landing was witnessed by crowds of 50,000 people who believed they were watching heroes. Rodriguez nodded, satisfied with her response. "That's why I wanted you on this, Mitchell. Most supervisors would need weeks to get up to speed, but you always seem to know these birds inside and out." "I stay current on all platform specifications, Chief," Sarah replied, the half-truth sliding easily off her tongue. "Never know when the knowledge might come in handy." What she didn't add was that during her off-duty hours, She still studied every update to the FA-18 systems, every modification to flight parameters, every change to performance specifications. In her dreams, she still flew not the lumbering cargo planes or patrol aircraft she now maintained, but the sleek fighters that pushed the boundaries of what humans and machines could accomplish together. As Rodriguez walked away, Sarah allowed herself a moment of reflection against the familiar bulk of the Jayhawk. 8 years of careful anonymity, of keeping her head down, of becoming invisible among the thousands of contractors and civil servants who kept America's military machine functioning. Now, the Blue Angels were coming home to Pensacola, bringing with them the ghosts of her former life. The squadron's current commander would be Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson. According to the briefing materials she had accessed through official channels, Thompson had joined the Blue Angels 2 years earlier, taking over from the previous commander who had retired after a distinguished career. The young officer's service record was impressive. Top Gun graduate combat veteran of operations in Syria and the Persian Gulf recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions during a classified mission that had prevented an international incident. But it was Thompson's personal history that sent ice through Sarah's veins. His father, Captain Michael "Iceman" Thompson, had been killed in 2016 during what official records described as a training accident involving experimental aircraft systems. The details were classified. The investigation sealed. The witnesses either transferred to distant postings or retired from active duty with uncomfortable speed. Sarah knew better. She knew because she had been there. Captain Thompson hadn't died in a training accident. He had died because he had discovered the same conspiracy that had destroyed Catherine Sullivan's career and life. He had died because he had been preparing to expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of naval aviation, a conspiracy that sold classified technology to foreign agents and eliminated anyone who threatened to reveal the truth. He had died because he had tried to save her. The trailer felt smaller than usual when Sarah returned that evening, the walls seeming to press inward with the weight of memories she had spent 8 years trying to suppress. She sat at her small kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, fighting the urge to walk to the bedroom closet and retrieve the sealed container hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The container held the only physical remnants of Catherine Sullivan's life. Her Navy Cross, her flight wings, a photograph of her standing beside her FA-18 Super Hornet at her first Blue Angels air show, and a handwritten letter from Captain Thompson that had arrived 3 days after his death. The letter had been smuggled to her by a mutual friend, a warning that her life was in danger, and instructions for how to disappear before the same forces that had killed him came for her. Sarah had followed those instructions, precisely faking her death in a carefully orchestrated accident that left behind a body burned beyond recognition and a service record that painted her as a traitor who had chosen death over facing justice. Only a handful of people knew the truth, and most of them were either dead or had been convinced that silence was the price of their own survival. But now Jake Thompson was coming to Pensacola carrying his father's name and his father's reputation, flying for the same squadron that had once been Catherine Sullivan's greatest pride. Did he know what had really happened to his father? Did he suspect that the woman who had been blamed for selling military secrets was actually another victim of the same conspiracy that had taken Captain Thompson's life? Sarah made her decision as she stared out her trailer window at the lights of Pensacola Naval Air Station gleaming in the distance. She would not request a transfer. She would not take leave during the Blue Angels' visit. She would face whatever challenges the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition brought, including the possibility of recognition by someone who might remember Lieutenant Commander Catherine Sullivan. 8 years of hiding had taught her patience, but they had not diminished the core of steel that had driven her to earn her wings, that had pushed her to join the Blue Angels, that had sustained her through combat missions and public adoration and the crushing betrayal that had nearly destroyed her soul. She was about to discover that some battles could only be postponed, never avoided. And sometimes the truth demanded a price that could only be paid in the bright, unforgiving light of public revelation. The next morning brought news that made Sarah's blood run cold. Chief Rodriguez approached her workstation with an expression that mixed professional excitement with personal concern. Mitchell got an update on the Blue Angels assignment. He said, consulting his clipboard, "Squadron's arriving a day early. Lieutenant Commander Thompson specifically requested our best maintenance supervisor for personal liaison duties." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. Personal liaison. Full access, direct coordination, one-on-one briefings on aircraft status, Rodriguez explained. Kid wants someone who can speak his language, someone who understands what these birds need to perform at demonstration level. The irony was staggering. Jake Thompson was unknowingly requesting the one person at Pensacola Naval Air Station who could speak his language better than anyone else alive, the former Blue Angels pilot, who had trained his father, who had flown combat missions alongside him, who had been with Captain Thompson the night before he died, trying to expose the truth. "When do I brief him?" Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Tomorrow morning, 800. Squadron lands at Euro 600, and Thompson wants a full aircraft status meeting before they start their practice sessions." Rodriguez studied her carefully. "You sure you're up for this? Mitchell working directly with the Blue Angels commander is, well, it's not exactly routine maintenance supervision." If only he knew, Sarah thought. If only any of them knew that they were asking Catherine Sullivan to pretend to be a stranger while working on the aircraft she had once flown better than anyone in naval aviation history. "I can handle it, Chief," she said simply. What she didn't say was that handling it might require her to face the son of the man who had died trying to save her life. What she didn't say was that tomorrow morning might be the beginning of the end of Sarah Mitchell's carefully constructed existence. What she didn't say was that she was ready for it to end. The Blue Angels arrived at Pensacola exactly on schedule, their 6 A-18 Super Hornets touching down in perfect formation as the sun painted the Gulf Coast sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Sarah watched from the maintenance hangar, her practiced eye automatically cataloging the slight variations in each aircraft's approach pattern, the subtle differences in engine sound that spoke to their individual mechanical personalities. Even after 8 years away from the cockpit, she could read an aircraft's condition from its flight characteristics the way a doctor might diagnose illness from a patient's complexion. These Super Hornets were in magnificent condition, maintained to the exacting standards that made the Blue Angels the premier flight demonstration squadron in the world. As the formation taxied toward the designated parking area, Sarah felt an unexpected surge of emotion. She had forgotten how beautiful they were, these sleek Predators painted in blue and gold, their surfaces gleaming like polished jewels in the morning light. Each aircraft represented the pinnacle of American aviation technology, but more than that, they represented the dreams and dedication of the men and women who flew them. Dreams she had once shared. Dreams that had been stolen from her by lies and betrayal, and the cold ambition of men who saw honor as a commodity to be traded for personal advancement. Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson climbed down from the lead aircraft with the fluid grace of a natural pilot. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that marked the best military aviators, alert, but not aggressive, focused, but not rigid. His resemblance to his father was striking: the same dark hair, the same intelligent eyes, the same way of moving that suggested coiled energy waiting for the right moment to be released. Sarah had seen that same combination of traits in Captain Michael Thompson, and the memory hit her like a physical blow. She had been standing on this same tarmac 8 years ago when Captain Thompson had climbed out of his A-18 after what would be his final flight. He had been investigating irregularities in aircraft maintenance records, following a trail of evidence that led to a conspiracy involving weapons sales and classified technology transfers. 3 days later, he was dead. "You must be Mitchell," a voice said behind her, startling Sarah from her memories. She turned to find Lieutenant Commander Thompson, approaching his flight helmet tucked under his arm. Up close, the resemblance to his father was even more pronounced, but there was something else in his expression, a wariness that suggested he carried more than the usual burdens of command. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, offering a crisp salute that felt both natural and strange after 8 years of civilian employment. "Sarah Mitchell, Maintenance Supervisor. Welcome to Pensacola." Thompson returned the salute with professional precision, but his eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer than protocol required. "Thank you, Mitchell. I've heard good things about your team's capabilities." Sarah studied his expression, searching for any sign of recognition. Did he see something familiar in her features? Had his father mentioned Catherine Sullivan in the months before his death? Thompson's service record indicated he had been deployed overseas during the events of 2016, but that didn't mean he hadn't heard the stories. "We maintain all platform types, sir," Sarah said carefully. "FA-18 Super Hornets are among my personal specialties." Something flickered in Thompson's eyes at her words. "Personal specialties." "I stay current on technical updates, sir. These aircraft represent the cutting edge of naval aviation technology. Understanding their systems isn't just professional responsibility, it's personal interest." Thompson nodded slowly, but Sarah noticed that his attention had shifted to something beyond professional courtesy. He was studying her the way a pilot might study weather patterns, looking for subtle indicators that might predict future conditions. "Tell me, Mitchell," he said, "how long have you been working maintenance at Pensacola?" 8 years, sir, since 2016. The year hung between them like an unspoken question. Thompson's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the date held significance for him as well. 2016, he repeated quietly. Interesting year for naval aviation. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Was he fishing for information, or did he know something about the events that had destroyed Catherine Sullivan's career? "Sir." "Nothing, Mitchell. Just thinking about some changes that happened around that time." And Thompson's smile was polite but distant. "I'd like to review the maintenance status on all 6 aircraft before we begin practice sessions tomorrow. Can you have detailed reports ready by 1400 hours? "Absolutely, sir. Full system status, maintenance history, and performance parameters for each aircraft." "Perfect." Thompson started to turn away, then paused. "One more thing, Mitchell. You seem to understand these aircraft better than most maintenance supervisors I've worked with. Any particular reason for that level of expertise?" The question felt loaded, weighted with implications that Sarah couldn't quite decipher. Was Thompson suspicious, or simply impressed by her technical knowledge? Either way, her answer needed to be carefully measured. "I believe in understanding the machines I'm responsible for, sir. These aircraft carry our pilots. Their lives depend on our work being perfect." Thompson studied her for another long moment before nodding. "Well," said Mitchell, "I have a feeling this is going to be an interesting assignment." As he walked away, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Jake Thompson was not the typical Blue Angels commander she remembered from her days with the squadron. He was watching, evaluating, searching for something that she couldn't identify, but that made her feel exposed in ways she hadn't experienced since creating the Sarah Mitchell identity. The next several hours passed in a blur of technical inspections and administrative coordination. Sarah's team worked with practiced efficiency, generating the detailed maintenance reports that Thompson had requested, while simultaneously preparing the aircraft for the intensive practice schedule that would begin the following day. Working around the A-18 Super Hornets brought back memories that Sarah had spent years suppressing. Her hands moved with unconscious familiarity across control surfaces and engine components, muscle memory, guiding her through inspections that required intimate knowledge of aircraft systems. More than once, she caught herself explaining technical details to her team with a depth of understanding that went beyond what any maintenance manual could provide. "Boss," called out Petty Officer Rodriguez, no relation to the chief, a young mechanic who had worked under Sarah's supervision for 3 years. "Take a look at this." Sarah joined him beside the number 3 aircraft, where he was examining the main landing gear assembly. "What am I looking at, Rodriguez?" "Wear pattern on the brake assembly. Nothing dangerous, but it's not standard. Looks like this bird has been doing some unconventional landing patterns." He pointed to the specific area of concern. "See how the wear is concentrated on the outboard edge? That's consistent with repeated crosswind landings, but the pattern suggests something more aggressive than normal operations." Sarah studied the brake assembly, her trained eye immediately recognizing what Rodriguez had identified. The wear pattern was indeed unusual, but not mysterious. It was the signature of a pilot who favored aggressive approach angles and precise touchdown control, the kind of flying that separated Blue Angels pilots from their more conventional counterparts. "It's normal for demonstration flying," she explained. "Blue Angels practice precision landings that require specific approach characteristics. This wear pattern indicates the pilot is executing textbook demonstration profiles." Rodriguez nodded, accepting her explanation, but Sarah noticed that Lieutenant Commander Thompson had appeared beside them during the discussion. He had been listening, and his expression suggested more than casual interest in her technical assessment. "Impressive analysis, Mitchell," Thompson said. "Most maintenance supervisors wouldn't recognize demonstration-specific wear patterns." Sarah felt the trap closing around her. Her knowledge was too detailed, too specific, too comprehensive for someone who had supposedly never worked with demonstration aircraft. She needed to deflect without arousing further suspicion. "I study all aspects of aircraft performance, sir. Understanding how different mission profiles affect mechanical systems helps me anticipate maintenance requirements." "I see." Thompson's tone remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence. "And where did you study demonstration flying characteristics?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that Thompson was not simply making conversation. He was conducting an interrogation, probing for inconsistencies in her cover story with the skill of someone trained to recognize deception. "Technical manuals, sir. Aviation publications. Professional development courses." Each answer was technically true, but incomplete, designed to satisfy curiosity without revealing dangerous details. Thompson nodded slowly, but Sarah could see that her responses hadn't satisfied his suspicions. If anything, they seemed to have confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. "Mitchell," he said, "I'd like you to join me for a walk around the aircraft. I want your assessment of overall squadron readiness." It wasn't a request. They walked in silence around the 6 Blue Angels aircraft, Thompson occasionally pointing out specific areas of interest, while Sarah provided technical assessments that demonstrated her comprehensive understanding of FA-18 systems. With each exchange, she could feel Thompson's attention becoming more focused, more analytical. "Tell me about your background before Pensacola," Thompson said as they completed their circuit around the aircraft. Sarah had rehearsed this conversation countless times over the past 8 years, preparing for the inevitable moment when someone would probe too deeply into Sarah Mitchell's history. The cover story was solid, documented through official channels and supported by carefully placed references. Previous assignment was maintenance operations at Naval Air Station Oceana, she said. Before that, various stations along the East Coast. Standard career progression for aviation maintenance personnel. Oceana, Thompson repeated. Interesting. My father was stationed there briefly in 2015. The mention of his father felt like a physical blow. Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral while her mind raced through the implications. Captain Thompson had indeed been at Oceana in 2015, conducting the investigation that would ultimately cost him his life. Had he mentioned Catherine Sullivan to his son? Had he shared his suspicions about the conspiracy that was targeting naval aviators who asked too many questions? "Small world, sir," Sarah managed to say. "Indeed." Thompson stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Mitchell, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." Sarah felt her pulse accelerate. "Yes, sir." "Do you know who Lieutenant Commander Catherine Sullivan was?" The question hit like a lightning strike. For a moment, Sarah felt the carefully constructed walls of her alternate identity threatening to crumble. Thompson was watching her reaction with the intensity of a predator, looking for any sign that his question had struck home. "The Blue Angels pilot who was court-martialed in 2016, Sarah replied, forcing her voice to remain steady, "died in an aircraft accident before the proceedings were completed." "That's the official story," Thompson said quietly. "But my father didn't believe it. He thought Catherine Sullivan was innocent. He thought she was set up by someone with access to classified systems and the authority to manipulate evidence." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Captain Thompson had shared his suspicions with his son. Jake Thompson wasn't just the Blue Angels commander, he was an investigator following his father's trail, searching for the truth about events that had been buried under layers of classification and misdirection. "Why are you telling me this, sir?" Sarah asked. Thompson studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because my father died 3 days after he started asking questions about Catherine Sullivan's case. Because everyone who supported her story was either transferred, retired, or silenced. Because 8 years later, I meet a maintenance supervisor who knows A-18 systems like she designed them herself." The accusation hung between them like a loaded weapon. Sarah realized that her cover was blown, that Jake Thompson had seen through the carefully constructed identity of Sarah Mitchell and recognized something that connected her to the events of 2016. But instead of fear, she felt something unexpected: relief. 8 years of hiding, of pretending to be someone else, of carrying the truth alone, had exhausted her in ways she was only beginning to understand. If Thompson was his father's son, if he was truly seeking justice rather than advancement, perhaps the time for hiding was finally over. "Sir," Sarah said carefully, "what exactly are you asking me?" Thompson glanced around the hangar, ensuring they were out of earshot of his squadron or her maintenance team. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying a burden for far too long. "I'm asking if you're Catherine Sullivan," he said quietly, "and I'm asking if you're ready to help me finish what my father started." The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun that could never be unfired. Sarah felt 8 years of carefully constructed lies and protective deception balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Jake Thompson stood before her with his father's eyes and his father's determination, waiting for an answer that could either vindicate the dead or destroy the living. Sarah looked around the hangar, noting the positions of her maintenance team and Thompson's squadron personnel. Everyone was focused on their assigned tasks, but military installations had a way of growing ears when conversations became interesting. What Thompson was suggesting, what he was asking, required absolute privacy and complete trust. "Sir," she said quietly, If we're going to have this conversation, it shouldn't be here. Thompson nodded, understanding immediately. Agreed. Are you familiar with the old section of base housing, the abandoned area near Perdido Bay? Sarah knew the location well. During her years at Pensacola, she had often run through the forgotten residential streets where naval families had once lived before budget cuts and base realignment had moved housing operations to newer facilities. The area was deserted now, visited only by maintenance crews and the occasional security patrol. "Meet me there at 2100 hours, Thompson said. "Come alone." The remainder of the day passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah went through the motions of supervising aircraft maintenance and coordinating with Blue Angels personnel, but her mind was elsewhere, racing through possibilities and potential consequences. If Thompson was genuine in his search for truth, if he truly believed his father had been murdered for investigating corruption, then revealing her identity might finally provide the ally she had never dared hope for. But if Thompson was working for the same forces that had destroyed Catherine Sullivan's career and killed his father, then tonight's meeting would likely be Sarah Mitchell's last. As evening approached, Sarah made her preparations with the methodical care of someone who understood that survival often depended on planning for the worst-case scenario. She drove her aging Ford pickup to a convenience store 3 miles from the base, where she purchased a prepaid cell phone and left a detailed message on the voicemail system of a number that hadn't been used in 8 years. If she failed to make a follow-up call within 24 hours, the message would automatically be forwarded to 3 different news organizations and a congressional oversight committee. Insurance of a sort. The abandoned housing area felt like a ghost town in the moonlight, empty streets lined with structures that had once sheltered military families, but now stood as hollow reminders of changing times and shifting priorities. Sarah parked her truck beside a rusted playground where children had once played, while their parents served America's interests around the world. Thompson was already there, sitting on a picnic table beneath a broken streetlight that cast strange shadows across his face. He had traded his flight suit for civilian clothes, jeans, and a navy sweatshirt that made him look younger and more vulnerable than his command presence suggested. "Thank you for coming," he said as Sarah approached. She remained standing, maintaining distance and keeping her hands free. 8 years of living with a target on her back had taught her to trust carefully and prepare for betrayal always. "Before we continue," Sarah said, "I need to know something." "How did you know?" Thompson smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. "My father kept detailed files on the Catherine Sullivan case. Files that were supposed to be destroyed after his death, but somehow survived. He documented everything: maintenance records, flight data, personnel assignments, witness statements that contradicted the official narrative." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope, holding it where Sarah could see it, but not approaching close enough to seem threatening. This envelope contains photographs of Lieutenant Commander Catherine Sullivan, taken during her final Blue Angels season. Candid shots from aircraft maintenance sessions, pilot briefings, squadron social events. Thompson's voice grew quieter. "When I first saw Sarah Mitchell 3 days ago, something seemed familiar. Tonight, I compared those photographs to my memories of our meeting." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "And the facial structure is different. The hair color, the weight, the way you carry yourself, all changed. But the eyes are the same. The way you move around aircraft is the same. The depth of technical knowledge is the same." Thompson paused. "You're Catherine Sullivan. My father died trying to prove your innocence, and you've been hiding in plain sight for 8 years." The moment of truth had arrived. Sarah could continue the deception, could maintain the Sarah Mitchell identity, and walk away from this confrontation. Or she could trust Jake Thompson with the secret that could either set her free or get them both killed. She made her choice. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm Catherine Sullivan." Thompson's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief mixed with vindication. "My father was right. He said you were innocent, that you'd been framed by someone with access to classified systems and the authority to manipulate evidence. And your father died because he got too close to the truth," Catherine said, using her real name for the first time in 8 years. "The same people who destroyed my career killed him to prevent exposure of a conspiracy that goes back decades." "Tell me," Thompson said. "Tell me everything." Catherine looked around the abandoned housing area, listening for any sound that might indicate surveillance or approaching personnel. The night was quiet, except for the distant sound of waves lapping against the Perdido Bay shoreline and the occasional aircraft taking off from the main base. "It started with irregularities in maintenance records," she began. "Aircraft components that were supposed to be replaced but weren't. Weapons systems that showed usage inconsistent with official training records. Flight data that had been altered after missions were completed." Thompson leaned forward, his attention completely focused on her words. "At first, I thought it was simple incompetence or bureaucratic confusion, but the patterns were too consistent, too deliberate. Someone was systematically falsifying records to cover unauthorized use of military aircraft and weapons." "Who?" "At the time, I suspected my immediate supervisor, Commander Marcus Rodriguez. He had access to Maintenance Systems Authority to authorize aircraft modifications and connections throughout the naval aviation community." Catherine paused, remembering the weight of those discoveries. But Rodriguez was just the operational level. The conspiracy went higher. Thompson pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket. "Do you mind?" Catherine shook her head. After 8 years of silence, she was ready to have her words preserved for posterity. "I started documenting everything," she continued, "photographing maintenance records, copying flight data, building a case that I planned to take to the Inspector General's office. But someone was watching someone who realized I was getting too close to explosive information." "What kind of information?" "Military aircraft being used for weapons smuggling, classified technology being transferred to foreign agents, defense contracts being awarded based on bribes rather than competitive bidding." Catherine's voice grew harder. "A corruption network that was using the Blue Angels as cover for operations that had nothing to do with flight demonstration." Thompson's expression grew grim. "How did they stop you?" "They framed me," Catherine said simply. "Falsified maintenance logs with my electronic signature, planted classified documents in my personal quarters, created witness statements that painted me as a disgruntled officer selling secrets for money." "But surely the investigation would have revealed the truth," Catherine laughed bitterly. "The investigation was controlled by the same people who had framed me. Evidence was suppressed, witnesses were intimidated or transferred, and anyone who supported my version of events was marginalized or removed from the process." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Catherine had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of understanding that came from personal loss. "My father found some of this out, didn't he? Your father was a good man and a great pilot," Catherine said gently. "When he realized I was being framed, he started his own investigation. He was building a case that would have exposed the entire conspiracy. And they killed him for it. The official report called it a training accident. Mechanical failure during a test flight of experimental avionics. But your father was too good a pilot to die from mechanical failure, and the aircraft wreckage was destroyed before any independent investigation could be conducted." Thompson's hands clenched into fists. 8 years. 8 years I've been wondering if my father died because of incompetence or bad luck. But he died because he was trying to do the right thing. He died trying to save me, Catherine corrected. 3 days before his death, he contacted me through a secure channel and warned me that I was in immediate danger. He told me how to disappear, how to create a new identity, how to survive until the truth could be revealed. But why haven't you come forward before now? Why continue hiding when you could expose these people? Catherine gestured toward the abandoned housing around them. Because the conspiracy didn't end with your father's death. Because the people involved have spent 8 years consolidating power and eliminating threats. Because coming forward without irrefutable evidence would only result in my death and the continued cover-up of their crimes. Thompson stood and began pacing his mind, clearly working through the implications. But now, things are different. The Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition is bringing attention to Pensacola, and my presence here gives us an opportunity that might not come again. What kind of opportunity? Thompson stopped pacing and faced her directly. To finish what my father started. To expose the conspiracy and clear your name. To make sure that his death and your sacrifice weren't meaningless. Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years, hope. But hope was dangerous, especially when it came attached to plans that involved confronting powerful enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "I'm proposing that we work together to gather evidence, expose the truth, and bring these people to justice." Thompson's voice carried the conviction of someone who had found a purpose worth dying for. "I'm proposing that Catherine Sullivan stop hiding and start fighting back." Catherine studied Jake Thompson's face in the dim moonlight, seeing his father's determination combined with a younger man's idealism. The proposal was appealing, but it was also potentially suicidal. The people they were discussing had killed Captain Thompson and destroyed dozens of careers to protect their conspiracy. They would not hesitate to eliminate both Catherine and Jake if they perceived a threat. "If we do this," Catherine said slowly, "we need to understand that we're declaring war on people who have the resources of the United States military at their disposal. They've killed before, and they'll kill again to protect themselves." "I understand," Thompson replied. "But I'd rather die fighting for the truth than live knowing I let my father's murderers go unpunished." Catherine nodded, recognizing the sentiment because she had felt it herself for 8 long years. But sentiment wouldn't be enough to survive what they were contemplating. "If we're going to do this, we need allies, people with access to information and the courage to act on it." Catherine paused. "Do you know who we can trust?" Thompson considered the question carefully. "There are a few people from my father's era who might be willing to help. Officers who were suspicious about his death, but couldn't act without evidence." "And there's someone else," Catherine added. "Someone who helped me disappear in 2016 and who has been monitoring the conspiracy ever since." "Who?" Catherine smiled for the first time since revealing her identity. "Someone who has been waiting 8 years for the chance to set things right. Someone who, like your father, believes that honor and duty are more important than personal safety." She pulled out the prepaid cell phone she had purchased earlier and dialed a number she had memorized but never used. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "I was wondering when you would call," said Admiral Eleanor Iron Eagle Patterson, retired. "I assume you're ready to come home, Catherine." The reunion took place at Earl's Diner, a 24-hour truck stop that sat on Highway 29 between Pensacola and the Alabama state line. The diner had been serving coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and pie sweet enough to make truckers weep since 1967, and its clientele consisted mainly of long-haul drivers, shift workers from the chemical plants, and the occasional insomniac seeking human contact in the small hours of the night. Admiral Eleanor Patterson looked exactly as Catherine remembered her from 8 years ago. Silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, steel-gray eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of ramrod-straight posture that came from 4 decades of military service. At 72, she remained formidable in a way that had nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with the kind of personal integrity that had become increasingly rare in modern military leadership. She sat in a corner booth, with her back to the wall, and a clear view of both entrances habits developed during intelligence assignments in places where survival depended on never being surprised. When Catherine and Jake entered the diner, Patterson's expression showed no surprise, only the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were finally coming to fruition. "Catherine," she said, rising to embrace her former protégé, "you look good, different but good." "Admiral," Catherine replied, surprised by the emotional impact of seeing her old mentor again. Patterson had been more than a commanding officer during Catherine's rise through naval aviation. She had been a role model, an advocate, and ultimately the person who had made Catherine's survival possible. "And you must be Jake Thompson," Patterson said, extending her hand to the younger officer. "You have your father's eyes, and I hope his integrity." Jake accepted the handshake with obvious respect. "Admiral Patterson, thank you for meeting with us. I've heard stories about your service record." Patterson's smile was brief but genuine. "Most of the interesting stories are still classified, son, but we're not here to discuss ancient history." She gestured for them to sit across from her in the booth. "We're here to discuss justice." A waitress who looked old enough to have served coffee to Eisenhower approached their table with the kind of professional friendliness that came from decades of dealing with travelers passing through. They ordered coffee and pie, establishing the cover of late-night diners, while discussing matters that could reshape American military leadership. "Before we begin," Patterson said once the waitress had departed, "I need you both to understand something. What we're contemplating isn't just career-ending, it's potentially life-ending. The people we're discussing have killed to protect their conspiracy, and they won't hesitate to kill again." Jake leaned forward slightly. "With respect, Admiral, my father is already dead. Catherine has already lost everything she worked for. I'm not sure how much more they can take from us." Patterson studied the young officer with approval. "Spoken like your father. He had the same willingness to sacrifice everything for principle." She turned to Catherine. "And you? Are you ready to stop hiding and start fighting?" Catherine had been asking herself the same question since Jake first confronted her with his suspicions. 8 years of Sarah Mitchell's life had been peaceful in a way that Catherine Sullivan's life had never been. No command pressure, no public scrutiny, no responsibility for multi-million-dollar aircraft, or the lives of the pilots who flew them. But it had also been empty, a half-life lived in the shadows of her former achievements. "I'm ready," Catherine said. "But I need to know what we're really facing. How deep does this conspiracy go?" Patterson reached into her purse and withdrew a manila folder that had seen better days. "Deeper than you suspected in 2016. Wider than your father imagined, Jake. More dangerous than either of you understands right now." She opened the folder to reveal photographs, documents, and what appeared to be organizational charts mapping relationships between military personnel, defense contractors, and political figures. "The conspiracy you stumbled onto, Catherine, wasn't just about weapons smuggling or technology transfers. It is about fundamentally corrupting American military leadership for profit." Patterson's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years documenting atrocities. "A network of officers, contractors, and politicians who have been systematically betraying their oaths for money." Jake studied the organizational chart, his expression growing grimmer with each connection he traced. How long have you known about this? I've suspected for 20 years. I've had proof for 8. Patterson met his eyes directly. Since 3 days after your father's death, when certain people made the mistake of trying to intimidate me into silence. Catherine felt ice form in her stomach. They threatened you. They tried to. Patterson's smile was predatory. I spent 30 years in naval intelligence, including assignments that don't officially exist. When a couple of third-rate conspirators tried to convince me that asking questions about Captain Thompson's death would be hazardous to my health, they discovered why my call sign was Iron Eagle. The waitress returned with coffee and pie, providing a momentary break in the conversation while they arranged their meal. The normalcy of the domestic scene, 3 people sharing dessert in a small-town diner, stood in stark contrast to the deadly serious nature of their discussion. "What happened to the people who threatened you?" Jake asked once they were alone again. "Nothing fatal," Patterson replied with obvious disappointment. "But they discovered that retired admirals have long memories and longer reach than most people suspect. One of them is currently serving a prison sentence for tax evasion. The other found his security clearance revoked and his defense contracting business mysteriously unable to secure government contracts." Catherine sipped her coffee, thinking through the implications. "If you've had proof for 8 years, why haven't you acted before now?" Patterson's expression grew serious. "Because the proof I had was sufficient to expose individual conspirators, but not to destroy the entire network. Because rushing forward with incomplete evidence would have resulted in a limited investigation that allowed the core leadership to escape justice while sacrificing a few expendable subordinates." She pulled out several additional documents from the folder. "But the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition provides an opportunity that may not come again. The event is bringing together military leadership, defense contractors, political figures, and international media in a way that creates both maximum exposure and maximum vulnerability for our enemies." Jake studied the documents Patterson had provided. "What kind of opportunity? The kind where the truth can be revealed in a forum that makes cover-up impossible," Patterson replied. "Where evidence can be presented to audiences that include congressional oversight committees, international allies, and investigative journalists who can't be intimidated or bought." Catherine felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that came with high-stakes planning. "What exactly are you proposing?" Patterson leaned back in her booth, her expression shifting to the calculating look that had made her legendary in intelligence circles. "I'm proposing that Catherine Sullivan return from the dead in the most public, most undeniable way possible. I'm proposing that we use the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition to expose the conspiracy that destroyed her career and killed Jake's father." "How?" Jake asked. Patterson's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "By having Catherine fly again, in front of 50,000 spectators, international media, and the very people who tried to destroy her." She paused for effect. "By proving beyond any doubt that the most famous traitor in recent naval aviation history is actually one of its greatest heroes." Catherine felt her pulse accelerate. The idea was audacious, dangerous, and potentially brilliant. It was also potentially suicidal. That would require access to aircraft official authorization and coordination with Blue Angel's leadership, Catherine said, thinking through the logistics. "Not to mention the small detail that Catherine Sullivan is officially dead." "Leave those details to me," Patterson said confidently. "What I need to know is whether you're willing to trust me with your life and your reputation one more time." Catherine looked across the table at Jake Thompson, seeing his father's determination combined with a younger man's idealism. She thought about 8 years of hiding, 8 years of living half a life, while the people who had destroyed her career continued to profit from their betrayal of everything the military was supposed to represent. "What do you need me to do?" Catherine asked. Patterson's smile was triumphant. "I need you to remember how to fly like Catherine Sullivan, and I need you to prepare for the performance of your lifetime." As they left Earl's Diner near midnight, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since 2016, the sense that she was moving towards something rather than running away from it. The conspiracy that had destroyed her career and killed Jake's father was about to face an enemy they had never anticipated, their own victims returning from the dead with proof of their crimes and the determination to see justice done. But as they drove back toward Pensacola, through the darkness of the Gulf Coast night, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. 8 years of paranoia had taught her to trust her instincts about surveillance, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that their meeting had not gone unnoticed. The war was about to begin, and their enemies already knew they were coming. The morning after their midnight meeting at Earl's Diner, Catherine found herself standing before a rusted gate that hadn't been opened in decades. Admiral Patterson had provided her with coordinates and a key, along with instructions to come alone and tell no one about the location. The address led to what appeared to be an abandoned industrial facility on the outskirts of Crestview, Florida, surrounded by pine forest and accessible only by a dirt road that most GPS systems didn't recognize. Catherine used the key Patterson had given her to unlock a chain that looked ancient but moved with the smooth precision of recently oiled metal. Beyond the gate, a cracked asphalt road led through overhanging trees to a collection of weathered buildings that looked like they had been forgotten by time and progress. As she drove deeper into the facility, Catherine began to notice details that suggested the abandonment was carefully maintained, rather than naturally occurring. The vegetation was controlled, the road surfaces were stable, despite their aged appearance, and several of the buildings showed signs of recent maintenance, disguised to look like decay. The largest structure was a massive hangar that had probably been built during World War II, its corrugated metal sides streaked with rust, but its foundation and framework solid as bedrock. Catherine parked beside the building and used a second key to open a personnel door that led into darkness. The lights came on automatically as she entered, revealing a sight that made her breath catch in her throat. 12 pristine P-51 Mustang fighters sat in perfect formation, their polished aluminum surfaces gleaming under the hangar lights like silver angels waiting for resurrection. Each aircraft bore the distinctive markings of the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, who had proven that courage and skill transcended the color of a pilot's skin during the darkest days of World War II. "Beautiful, aren't they?" said a voice behind her. Catherine turned to find a man approaching from the shadows at the far end of the hangar. He appeared to be in his 70s with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in the sun and wind. Despite his age, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had maintained his physical condition through rigorous discipline, and his eyes held the alert intelligence of a man who missed nothing. "Earl Washington," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Folks call me Grumpy, though I can't imagine why." Catherine accepted the handshake, noting the strength in his grip and the old burn scars that marked him as someone who had worked around aircraft engines for most of his life. "Catherine Sullivan, Admiral Patterson said you might be able to help us." Earl's smile was wolfish. "Patterson and I go back a long way. Served together in some places that don't officially exist, did some things that never officially happened." He gestured toward the P-51s. "She thought you might appreciate seeing these before we get down to business." Catherine walked among the aircraft, her trained eye automatically cataloging their condition and specifications. These weren't museum pieces or static displays. They were fully operational warbirds maintained to exacting standards by someone who understood their historical significance and mechanical requirements. "They're magnificent," Catherine said. "But why are they here?" Earl's expression grew serious. "Because sometimes the only way to honor the past is to use it to fight for the future." He paused beside one of the aircraft, his hand resting on its propeller. "This particular bird belonged to my grandfather, Captain James Jimmy Sullivan." Catherine felt the world tilt around her. "Sullivan. Your grandfather," Earl said quietly, "though I suspect you never knew the whole story about how he died." Catherine's mind raced through family history that had been carefully edited and sanitized over the decades. She had been told that her grandfather had died heroically in combat over Germany, shot down while protecting a formation of bombers. A standard tale of wartime sacrifice that honored his memory while revealing nothing about the true circumstances of his death. "Tell me," Catherine said. Earl led her to a workbench where several folders lay open, revealing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a detailed investigation report that had never been filed through official channels. "Captain Jimmy Sullivan wasn't shot down by German fighters," Earl began. "He was murdered by American officers who discovered that he had uncovered a conspiracy to sell military intelligence to the Nazis." The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. Her grandfather hadn't just been a war hero, he had been an investigator who had died trying to expose the same kind of corruption that had destroyed her own career 70 years later. "The conspiracy your grandfather discovered involved high-ranking officers who were providing the Germans with information about Allied bombing targets, convoy routes, and planned operations," Earl continued. "When Jimmy threatened to expose them, they arranged for him to be shot down by friendly fire during what was supposed to be a routine escort mission." Catherine studied the documents Earl had provided, seeing parallels between her grandfather's investigation and her own discoveries in 2016. The methods were different, the technology had evolved, but the fundamental corruption was identical: military officers betraying their oaths for money while destroying anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. "How do you know all this?" Catherine asked. Earl's smile was grim. "Because I helped investigate it. 60 years ago, when I was a young airman trying to understand why good men were dying in accidents that didn't make sense. Because I've spent my entire life documenting a conspiracy that reaches back to World War II and forward to the present day." He opened another folder, revealing organizational charts that showed connections between military officers, defense contractors, and political figures spanning multiple decades. Catherine recognized some of the names from her own investigation in 2016, but Earl's documentation went deeper and reached further than anything she had uncovered. "The network that framed you, Catherine, isn't just a recent development. It's the latest evolution of a corruption system that has been operating since the 1940s, adapting to new technologies and new opportunities, but never changing its fundamental nature." Catherine felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Earl was revealing. "Why haven't you exposed this before now?" "Because exposure without the ability to destroy the entire network only results in temporary setbacks, while the core leadership escapes justice," Earl replied. "Because rushing forward with incomplete evidence allows them to sacrifice a few expendable subordinates while preserving the essential structure." He pulled out a final set of documents. "But Admiral Patterson believes that the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition provides an opportunity that may not come again, a chance to expose the conspiracy in a forum that makes cover-up impossible." Catherine studied the documents, seeing evidence of corruption that spanned decades and involved hundreds of military personnel, contractors, and political figures. The scope was staggering, but so was the opportunity for justice that Earl and Patterson were describing. "What do you need me to do?" Catherine asked. Earl's expression shifted to something that reminded her of her grandfather in the old photographs, determination mixed with the kind of controlled anger that came from seeing too much injustice go unpunished. "I need you to fly like a Sullivan," he said, "and I need you to help me make sure that your grandfather's sacrifice, and your father's sacrifice, and Captain Thompson's sacrifice weren't meaningless." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Catherine tensed her hand, moving instinctively toward the concealed weapon she had carried for 8 years, but Earl's expression showed anticipation rather than concern. "Relax," Earl said. "Those are our reinforcements." 3 vehicles pulled up to the hangar entrance, a military Humvee, a civilian pickup truck, and a van that looked like it belonged to a cable television repair service. The occupants who emerged represented a cross-section of American military experience spanning 5 decades. Admiral Patterson led the group, followed by Jake Thompson and 2 people Catherine didn't recognize. The first was a woman in her 50s with short auburn hair and the kind of alert eyes that marked her as medical personnel. The second was a man who appeared to be in his early 60s, wearing civilian clothes, but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer. "Catherine," Patterson said, "I'd like you to meet the rest of our team. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, former Navy flight surgeon, and the person who made Sarah Mitchell's existence possible 8 years ago." Dr. Hayes stepped forward with a professional smile. "It's good to see you again, Catherine. You look healthy, which is more than I expected after 8 years of living under an assumed identity." Catherine accepted the doctor's handshake, remembering the woman who had helped stage her death and create the medical records that had made Sarah Mitchell's existence believable. "Dr. Hayes, I never got the chance to thank you properly." "Thank me by surviving what we're about to attempt," Hayes replied. "Because if this goes wrong, I may need to resurrect you again." Patterson gestured toward the older man. "And this is Colonel Marcus Razor Torres, retired Air Force. He was Captain Thompson's friend and the person who provided the intelligence that convinced me your father had been murdered." Torres stepped forward with the kind of firm handshake that suggested he had been a hands-on leader rather than a desk officer. "Ms. Sullivan, your father was a good man and a great pilot. I'm honored to help clear his name." Catherine felt the weight of accumulated justice pressing down on her shoulders. These people had been carrying the burden of truth for years, waiting for the right moment to act. The Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition represented that moment, but success would require perfect coordination and the kind of courage that had defined the best traditions of American military service. "What's the plan?" Catherine asked. Patterson gestured toward Earl's workbench, where detailed diagrams had been laid out showing the layout of Pensacola Naval Air Station and the planned sequence of events for the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition. "The plan is ambitious, dangerous, and our only realistic chance for exposing the conspiracy before they realize we're coming," Patterson began. "On the final day of the exhibition, during the climactic Blue Angels demonstration, Catherine Sullivan will return from the dead in the most public way possible." Jake studied the diagrams with obvious interest. "How do we get Catherine into position to fly?" "Leave that to me," Patterson replied. "What I need from you, Jake, is coordination from inside the Blue Angels squadron. When the moment comes, I need you to be ready to support Catherine's demonstration without revealing advanced knowledge of the plan." Torres leaned forward. "What about the evidence? Flying demonstrations are impressive, but they won't expose the conspiracy by themselves." Patterson's smile was sharp. "Earl and I have been documenting this corruption network for 8 years. We have financial records, communication intercepts, witness testimony, and photographic evidence that will destroy careers and send people to federal prison." She paused. "What we need is a forum that ensures the evidence can't be suppressed or classified after the fact. Dr. Hayes nodded understanding. A public venue with international media coverage and multiple government oversight committees in attendance. Exactly, Patterson confirmed. The Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition will include representatives from Congress, the Department of Defense, international allies, and investigative journalists from around the world. When we reveal the evidence, it will be impossible to contain or control the narrative. Catherine studied the faces around her, seeing the kind of determination that had defined America's greatest military moments. These people were willing to risk everything, careers, reputations, possibly their lives, to ensure that justice was finally served. "When do we begin?" Catherine asked. Earl's smile was anticipatory. "We've already begun. The question is whether you're ready to become Catherine Sullivan again." The abandoned Texaco station on Highway 29 looked like countless others scattered across rural America, a relic of an era when gasoline cost 30 cents a gallon and interstate highways were ambitious dreams rather than concrete realities. The pumps had been removed decades ago, leaving only concrete islands and the kind of weeds that seemed to thrive in places where civilization had retreated. But appearances, as Catherine had learned over 8 years of living under a false identity, could be devastatingly deceptive. Earl Washington pulled his pickup truck behind the station's crumbling building, parking in a spot that couldn't be seen from the highway. Catherine followed in her own vehicle, noting the way Earl positioned himself to have multiple escape routes while maintaining visual surveillance of approaching traffic. "Paranoid habits die hard," Earl explained as they walked toward what appeared to be a rusted service bay door. "Especially when they've kept you alive for 60 years. He produced an electronic key fob that looked incongruously modern against the station's 1960s architecture. The service bay door rose with the smooth whisper of recently maintained machinery, revealing an interior that bore no resemblance to an abandoned gas station. The space had been converted into a sophisticated intelligence center that would have impressed the analysts at Langley. Computer monitors lined the walls, displaying real-time data feeds from what appeared to be multiple government and military databases. Communication equipment filled one corner, while another held file cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. "Welcome to my retirement hobby," Earl said with obvious pride. "Turns out that 60 years of military intelligence work gives you some useful skills for independent research." Catherine studied the setup with professional admiration. "This is impressive. How long have you been operating out of here?" 25 years, ever since I realized that official channels weren't going to address the corruption I was documenting." Earl moved to one of the computer terminals, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with surprising dexterity. "The beauty of this location is that nobody looks twice at an old gas station. Perfect cover for activities that require privacy." The main monitor displayed what appeared to be an organizational chart, showing connections between military personnel, defense contractors, and political figures. Red lines indicated confirmed relationships, while yellow lines suggested probable connections that required additional verification. "This is everything we know about the conspiracy that destroyed your career," Earl explained. "Names, dates, financial transactions, communication records, witness statements, 8 years of investigation compressed into a single database." Catherine studied the chart, recognizing some names from her own 2016 investigation, but seeing connections she had never suspected. The scope was staggering, hundreds of people involved in a corruption network that spanned multiple branches of the military and reached into the highest levels of defense, contracting, and political oversight. "How did they manage to keep this hidden for so long?" Catherine asked. Earl's expression grew grim. "The same way all successful conspiracies work, by operating through legitimate channels and maintaining strict compartmentalization. Most participants only knew their small piece of the operation, never seeing the full scope of what they were supporting. He highlighted several names on the chart. But there were always a few people at the top who understood the complete picture. People like Admiral Marcus Rodriguez, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Catherine felt ice form in her stomach. Rodriguez is part of this. Rodriguez didn't just participate in the conspiracy, Earl replied. He created it. Everything we've documented traces back to decisions made by Marcus Rodriguez when he was a junior officer in the 1990s. The revelation was staggering. Admiral Rodriguez wasn't just another corrupt officer. He was the architect of a system that had been betraying American military interests for decades. And now he held the highest position in the American military hierarchy. If Rodriguez is chairman of the Joint Chiefs, how do we expose him? Catherine asked. He has access to the highest levels of government and the authority to classify or suppress any evidence that threatens him. Earl's smile was predatory, because Rodriguez made one critical mistake. He assumed that everyone he destroyed was either dead or too intimidated to fight back. He never considered the possibility that his victims might survive and spend years building an airtight case against him. Earl moved to another terminal accessing files that contained detailed financial records. Rodriguez has been using his military positions to facilitate weapons sales technology transfers and defense contract awards that have netted his network hundreds of millions of dollars over the past 30 years. Catherine studied the financial data, seeing patterns of corruption that dwarfed anything she had imagined during her 2016 investigation. This isn't just about military corruption. This is about systematically betraying American national security for profit. Exactly, Earl confirmed. And the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition represents our best opportunity to expose Rodriguez before he realizes we're coming for him. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Earl moved quickly to a bank of security monitors that showed multiple camera angles around the abandoned gas station. Two black SUVs were pulling into the parking area, their occupants moving with the kind of tactical precision that suggested military or law enforcement training. Problem? Earl said, his voice carrying the calm professionalism of someone who had faced similar situations before. We've got company. Catherine drew her concealed weapon, checking the chamber while positioning herself to have clear fields of fire toward the building's entrances. How did they find us? Earl was already moving toward what appeared to be a maintenance closet, but was actually an armored safe room. Same way we found them, by following the electronic breadcrumbs that everyone leaves in the modern world. He began rapidly downloading files from his computer system to portable drives. The good news is that I've been preparing for this possibility for 25 years. The sound of forced entry came from the front of the building, followed by the measured footsteps of professionals conducting a systematic search. Catherine counted at least 6 individuals based on the sound patterns, all moving with the kind of coordination that suggested extensive tactical training. "Sullivan, Washington," a voice called out. "Federal agents." "We just want to talk," Earl snorted with disgust. "Federal agents, my ass. Rodriguez's cleanup crew, more likely." He finished his download operations and began activating what appeared to be a building security system. "Ready to leave." Catherine nodded, following Earl toward a concealed exit that led to underground tunnels she hadn't noticed during their arrival. "Where does this go?" "Survival route I installed 20 years ago," Earl replied. "Connects to a drainage system that runs beneath Highway 29. We'll come up a half-mile from here where I have transportation waiting." As they moved through the tunnels, Catherine could hear the sound of their pursuers discovering the intelligence center. Shouted commands and the crash of equipment being destroyed suggested that whoever had found them was more interested in eliminating evidence than capturing prisoners. The tunnel system was more sophisticated than Catherine had expected, with multiple branches and what appeared to be supply caches positioned at strategic intervals. Earl moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had memorized every detail of his escape routes. "How often have you had to use this?" Catherine asked, as they navigated a particularly narrow section. "Third time in 25 years, Earl replied. "Each time the people hunting me got a little more sophisticated. But I've had 60 years to learn how to stay ahead of people who want me dead." They emerged from the tunnel system near a small farm that appeared to be abandoned, but showed signs of recent maintenance. A battered pickup truck sat beside a collapsing barn, its appearance deliberately designed to avoid attracting attention. As they drove away from the area, Catherine could see smoke rising from the direction of the gas station. Whoever had discovered Earl's base of operations was ensuring that no evidence survived their visit. 25 years of work, Earl said, his voice carrying more resignation than anger. "But at least we got the important files." Catherine studied the man beside her, seeing someone who had spent decades fighting a lonely battle against corruption that most people couldn't even imagine. "I'm sorry about your base." Earl's smile was grim but determined. "Don't be. This just means we're getting close to something Rodriguez considers important enough to risk exposure." He glanced at the portable drives containing his downloaded files. "And it means our timeline just accelerated. We can't wait for the perfect moment anymore." "What do you mean?" Earl's expression hardened with resolve. "I mean, it's time to bring Catherine Sullivan back from the dead whether we're ready or not. Because if we wait much longer, Rodriguez is going to eliminate everyone who threatens his conspiracy." As they drove through the Florida countryside toward their next safe house, Catherine realized that their war against the corruption network had officially begun. Rodriguez knew they were coming, which made them infinitely more dangerous but also more vulnerable. The next few days would determine whether decades of injustice would finally be exposed or whether the conspiracy would succeed in eliminating the last witnesses to its crimes. The conversation Catherine had been dreading for 8 years took place in the most unlikely setting imaginable. The parking lot of a Cracker Barrel restaurant on Interstate 65, halfway between Pensacola and Montgomery. Jake Thompson had suggested the location because it offered anonymity among the constant flow of travelers while providing multiple escape routes if their meeting was discovered. Catherine arrived first, parking her pickup truck where she could observe approaching traffic while remaining inconspicuous among the other vehicles. The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of hiding from the truth, she was about to reveal secrets that could destroy the carefully constructed relationship she had built with the son of the man who had died trying to save her. Jake arrived precisely on time, his personal vehicle a modest sedan that matched his cover story of a Blue Angels pilot taking a day of personal leave to visit family in Alabama. He approached Catherine's truck with the kind of casual alertness that marked him as his father's son, aware of his surroundings, but not obviously paranoid. "Thank you for meeting me," Jake said as he climbed into the passenger seat. "I know this isn't easy." Catherine studied his face, seeing Captain Thompson's features combined with an intensity that belonged uniquely to Jake. "Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you will change how you see your family, your father, and probably your entire military career." Jake's expression grew serious. "My father is dead because he tried to help you expose corruption in the military. I think I can handle whatever else you need to tell me." Catherine took a deep breath, preparing to reveal secrets she had carried alone for 8 years. "Jake, your father wasn't just investigating the conspiracy that destroyed my career. He was investigating the people who killed your biological parents." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Catherine watched as his expression shifted from confusion to understanding to a kind of controlled fury that reminded her painfully of his adoptive father during his final days. "What are you talking about?" Jake asked quietly. Catherine reached into her jacket and withdrew a manila envelope that contained copies of documents Earl Washington had provided. "Your biological father was Lieutenant Commander Alexei Volkov, a Russian pilot who defected to the United States in 1989 with information about Soviet aviation technology." Jake took the documents with hands that weren't quite steady. "I was told my biological parents died in a car accident when I was 3. "Your biological mother did die in an accident," Catherine confirmed, "but your father was murdered by the same people who later framed me and killed Captain Thompson. They killed him because the information he brought from Russia exposed American officers who had been selling military secrets to the Soviets." Jake studied the documents, his expression growing harder with each page. The files contained official immigration records, debriefing reports, and witness statements that painted a picture of a Russian pilot who had risked everything to provide the United States with critical intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. Lieutenant Commander Volkov's defection provided information that allowed the Navy to develop countermeasures against advanced Soviet aircraft, Catherine continued. But it also revealed that several American officers had been providing the Soviets with classified information about our own capabilities. The same conspiracy you uncovered in 2016. The same network evolved over decades, but fundamentally unchanged, Catherine confirmed. Your biological father threatened their operation by exposing how they had been betraying American interests for profit. So they eliminated him and arranged for you to be adopted by Captain Thompson. Jake was quiet for several long minutes, processing information that recontextualized his entire understanding of his family history. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the controlled anger of someone who had just learned that his life had been shaped by lies and murder. "Captain Thompson knew who I really was. Captain Thompson adopted you specifically because he knew who you were," Catherine replied gently. "He understood that you were the son of a hero who had been murdered for trying to serve America, and he was determined to ensure that you had the chance to live up to your father's legacy." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "So everything I've accomplished, everything I've achieved, it's all connected to this conspiracy." Catherine reached out and placed her hand over his. "Everything you've accomplished, you've achieved through your own talent and dedication. The conspiracy shaped the circumstances of your life, but it didn't determine your choices or your character." Jake nodded slowly, but Catherine could see that he was struggling to reconcile this new information with everything he had believed about his family and his career. "There's something else," Catherine added. "Something that makes your role in exposing this conspiracy even more important." Jake looked up from the documents. "What?" Catherine withdrew another set of papers from the envelope. "Your biological father didn't just provide information about Soviet aviation technology. He provided evidence that American defense contractors were deliberately selling inferior equipment to the military while pocketing the difference in cost." Jake studied the new documents, his expression growing grimmer. "Equipment failures that cost lives. Equipment failures that were designed to generate replacement contracts while ensuring that American pilots faced unnecessary risks," Catherine confirmed. "Your biological father died trying to expose a conspiracy that was literally profiting from the deaths of American service members." The revelation seemed to hit Jake even harder than learning about his adoption. Catherine watched as he processed the implications that the people who had killed his biological father were still operating, still profiting from betraying the men and women who served their country. "How long have you known about this?" Jake asked. "I suspected after Captain Thompson's death, but I didn't have proof until Earl Washington showed me his files," Catherine replied. Your adoptive father was getting close to the same information when he was killed." Jake was quiet again, staring out the windshield at the ordinary scene of travelers and families going about their daily lives. When he spoke again, his voice carried a resolve that reminded Catherine of both his fathers. "What do we need to do to stop them?" Catherine felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. Jake Thompson had just learned that his entire life had been shaped by a conspiracy that had murdered both his fathers, and his immediate response was to seek justice rather than safety. "We need to expose them in a way that makes cover-up impossible," Catherine replied. "We need to present evidence to an audience that includes congressional oversight committees, international allies, and investigative journalists who can't be intimidated or bought." The Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition. Exactly. Admiral Patterson believes that the exhibition provides our best opportunity to reveal the truth in a forum that Rodriguez can't control. Catherine paused. "But it's going to require you to risk everything: your career, your reputation, possibly your life." Jake's smile was grim but determined. "They've already taken everything that matters. My biological father, my adoptive father, 8 years of your life. I'm not going to let them take anything else." Catherine studied the young officer sitting beside her, seeing the best qualities of both his fathers combined with a determination that was uniquely his own.
"Are you sure about this, Jake? Once we start down this path, there's no going back."
"I've been sure since the day I learned my father was murdered," Jake replied. "The only question is how we make them pay for what they've done." Catherine reached into her jacket and withdrew a secure communication device that Admiral Patterson had provided. "Then it's time to begin final preparations, because in 3 days, Catherine Sullivan is going to return from the dead, and the people who destroyed our families are going to face justice." As they prepared to leave the restaurant parking lot, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since 2016. The sense that she was no longer fighting alone. Jake Thompson represented more than just an ally in their campaign against corruption. He represented the future of military service that his fathers had died trying to protect. The war was about to begin, and this time they were going to win. The final planning session took place in an unexpected location, the basement of a small Baptist church in Crestview, Florida, whose pastor had served as a Navy chaplain for 20 years before retiring to tend his rural congregation. Reverend Samuel Cross had known Admiral Patterson during her intelligence career and had maintained the kind of security clearance that allowed him to host meetings that never officially occurred. The basement looked like it had been designed for church suppers and youth group meetings with folding tables, metal chairs, and inspirational posters covering the concrete walls. But tonight, it served as a command center for an operation that would either expose decades of military corruption or result in the deaths of everyone present. Admiral Patterson sat at the head of the longest table, surrounded by the allies, who had committed themselves to seeking justice, regardless of personal cost. Catherine occupied the chair to Patterson's right, her position reflecting her role as the primary catalyst for everything they were about to attempt. Jake Thompson sat across from her, his expression showing the kind of focused intensity that came from someone who had found a purpose worth dying for. Earl Washington had set up a portable computer system that displayed detailed schematics of Pensacola Naval Air Station, along with timing charts that showed the planned sequence of events for the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition. Dr. Rebecca Hayes reviewed medical supplies and emergency protocols, preparing for the possibility that their operation would result in casualties. Colonel Marcus Torres studied personnel files and communication intercepts, identifying potential threats and opportunities within the military command structure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patterson began, "in 18 hours, Catherine Sullivan will return from the dead in front of 50,000 spectators and international media. Our success depends on perfect coordination, flawless execution, and the kind of courage that has defined the best traditions of American military service. She gestured toward Earl's computer display, which showed aerial photographs of the Naval Air Station taken earlier that day. The exhibition will begin at 1,000 hours with static displays and vendor presentations. The Blue Angels demonstration is scheduled for 1,500 hours with international media coverage and live streaming to military installations worldwide. Jake leaned forward. "What's our insertion plan for Catherine?" Patterson's smile was sharp. "Catherine won't be inserted into the demonstration. She'll be creating her own demonstration using assets that Rodriguez doesn't know we possess." Earl highlighted a section of the air station that appeared to show auxiliary hangars and maintenance facilities. Hangar 19 houses the P-51 Mustang aircraft we showed Catherine yesterday. These aircraft are fully operational and maintained to demonstration standards. Catherine studied the tactical display, understanding the implications. "You want me to fly one of the P-51s during the Blue Angels demonstration? I want you to appear in the sky over Pensacola, in an aircraft that will be instantly recognizable to anyone who knows aviation history," Patterson replied. "I want you to execute flying maneuvers that only Catherine Sullivan could perform in front of an audience that includes people who knew you personally." The plan was audacious, dangerous, and potentially brilliant. Catherine would be revealing her identity in the most public way possible, while simultaneously demonstrating skills that couldn't be faked or duplicated. But it was also potentially suicidal. "What about air traffic control?" Jake asked. "Unauthorized aircraft in demonstration airspace will trigger immediate scramble responses." Torres consulted his personnel files. "I have contacts in the tower who can provide a 5-minute window during the Blue Angels routine, long enough for Catherine to make her appearance and deliver her message." Dr. Hayes looked up from her medical preparations. "And if something goes wrong, if Catherine's aircraft is damaged, or if she's injured during the demonstration," Patterson's expression grew serious. "Then we proceed with Plan B, which involves Jake revealing his identity and the evidence we've gathered through Blue Angels communication channels." Catherine felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed, depended on her ability to fly like Catherine Sullivan one more time. "What about the evidence itself?" Catherine asked. "Flying demonstrations are impressive, but they won't convict Rodriguez and his conspirators." Earl activated another section of his computer system, revealing files that contained 8 years of accumulated evidence. "The moment Catherine appears in the sky, automated systems will begin transmitting our complete case file to news organizations, congressional oversight committees, and international allies." Patterson nodded. "Rodriguez will have approximately 10 minutes to respond before the information becomes public knowledge. Not enough time to organize a cover-up or eliminate witnesses." Jake studied the timing charts with obvious concern. 10 minutes is enough time for him to order my squadron to shoot down Catherine's aircraft." The statement hung in the air like a death sentence. Catherine had considered the possibility, but hearing it stated directly by someone who understood Blue Angel's capabilities made the risk feel immediate and personal. "That's why your role is so critical, Jake," Patterson said. "You'll be in position to prevent or delay any hostile response until Catherine can complete her demonstration and land safely." Catherine looked around the table at the faces of people who were willing to risk everything for justice. "Are we sure this is our only option? Once we begin, there's no way to stop the chain of events." Patterson's expression grew solemn. "Catherine Rodriguez and his network have been operating for 30 years. They've killed dozens of good people and betrayed American interests for hundreds of millions of dollars. If we don't stop them now, they'll continue destroying lives until someone else finds the courage to act. Earl pulled up files showing recent activities by Rodriguez's network. Our intelligence indicates that Rodriguez is planning to eliminate the remaining witnesses to his conspiracy within the next 6 months. If we wait, we'll all be dead, and the truth will die with us. The revelation sent a chill through the basement meeting room. Catherine realized that they weren't just seeking justice, they were fighting for their lives against an enemy who had already demonstrated a willingness to kill to protect his secrets. "Then we do this," Catherine said. "We expose Rodriguez and his conspiracy, and we make sure that Captain Thompson and Lieutenant Commander Volkov and all the others didn't die for nothing." Patterson nodded with satisfaction. "Final equipment check in 2 hours. Aircraft preparation begins at 0400. Catherine, I need you to get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be the most important day of your life." As the meeting broke up, Jake approached Catherine with an expression that mixed determination with something that looked like fear. "Catherine," he said quietly, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens tomorrow, I'm honored to be fighting alongside you." Catherine felt tears threatening for the first time in years. "Jake, your fathers would be proud of the man you've become." "I hope so," Jake replied, "because tomorrow we're going to find out if their sacrifices meant anything." As Catherine drove through the Florida darkness toward her final night, as Sarah Mitchell, she thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 8 years of hiding, of living half a life while carrying the burden of truth alone. Tomorrow she would either expose the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives, or she would die trying. Either way, Catherine Sullivan was finally coming home. Dawn broke over Pensacola Naval Air Station with the kind of crystal clarity that promised perfect flying weather. Catherine stood beside the restored P-51 Mustang in Hangar 19, her hands trembling slightly as she performed the pre-flight inspection that would determine whether she lived or died in the next few hours. The aircraft was magnificent polished aluminum skin, gleaming like silver fire. The distinctive markings of the 332nd Fighter Group painted with meticulous accuracy to honor the Tuskegee Airmen who had fought fascism with courage and skill. Her grandfather's aircraft, the machine that would carry her back from the dead. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" Earl Washington emerged from the shadows carrying a leather flight jacket that looked like it had survived decades of careful storage. This belonged to Captain Jimmy Sullivan. Figured it was time for it to fly again. Catherine accepted the jacket with hands that weren't quite steady. The leather was soft with age, but still solid, and she could feel the weight of history in its worn surfaces. "Thank you, Earl. This means more than you know." Earl's weathered face showed the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing justice finally within reach. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you're about to do. Hell, he'd probably want to fly alongside you if he could." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their moment of reflection. Admiral Patterson's convoy arrived precisely on schedule, followed by Jake Thompson in his personal vehicle and Dr. Hayes in a van that had been configured as a mobile medical unit. The final pieces of their operation were falling into place with the precision that had defined their months of planning. Patterson approached with the brisk efficiency that had marked her entire military career. "Catherine, final communications check. Once you're airborne, we'll have approximately 10 minutes to coordinate between your demonstration and the evidence release." Catherine accepted the sophisticated radio equipment that would allow her to maintain contact with their command center throughout the demonstration. "What's the latest intelligence on Rodriguez's location?" Torres consulted his secure communication device. Rodriguez arrived at Pensacola 3 hours ago aboard the Secretary of Defense's aircraft. He's currently in the VIP viewing area, with congressional representatives and international military attachés. The irony was perfect. Rodriguez would be sitting in the place of honor, accepting accolades for his distinguished military service, when Catherine Sullivan rose from the dead to expose him as a traitor and murderer. Jake checked his watch with the kind of nervous energy that came from someone about to risk everything on a single operation. Blue Angel's brief in 30 minutes. I need to be in position before anyone starts asking questions about my absence. Patterson nodded. Remember, your job is to prevent hostile response until Catherine can complete her demonstration. If Rodriguez tries to order military intervention, you need to delay or misdirect until we can get the evidence public. Jake's expression was grim but determined. Understood. If anyone tries to shoot down Catherine's aircraft, they'll have to go through me first. As Jake departed for his squadron briefing, Catherine felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar flight suit. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed, came down to the next few hours. Success would vindicate decades of injustice and expose a conspiracy that had betrayed American military interests for generations. Failure would likely result in their deaths and the continued cover-up of crimes that reached the highest levels of government. Dr. Hayes approached with a medical kit that looked more comprehensive than anything typically found outside a military hospital. Catherine, I know I can't talk you out of this, but I want you to understand the risks. If your aircraft is damaged during the demonstration, if you're injured during ejection or forced landing, our ability to provide medical support will be extremely limited. Catherine accepted the emergency medical supplies with professional calm. Doctor, I've been living on borrowed time for 8 years. If this is how it ends, at least it ends with the truth. Earl completed his final inspection of the P-51's engine systems, his experienced hands checking connections and fluid levels with the kind of attention to detail that separated competent mechanics from masters of their craft. Engines running, perfect flight controls, our responsive fuel system is topped off. She's ready to fly like your grandfather intended. Catherine climbed into the cockpit with movements that felt both foreign and familiar after 8 years away from military aircraft. The P-51's controls were different from the modern fighters she had flown with the Blue Angels, but the fundamental relationship between pilot and machine remained unchanged. This was what she had been born to do, what had defined her identity before lies and betrayal had forced her into hiding. As she strapped herself into the ejection seat, Catherine felt the last remnants of Sarah Mitchell's carefully constructed identity falling away. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would face it as Catherine Sullivan, Blue Angels pilot, Navy Cross recipient, and the woman who had been wrongfully destroyed by men who put profit above honor. Patterson's voice crackled through her headset. Catherine, final weather check. Shows winds calm, visibility unlimited, no precipitation forecasted. Conditions are perfect for flying. Roger that, Admiral. Thanks for giving me the chance to come home. Patterson's response carried 8 years of accumulated emotion. Thank you for having the courage to fight back. Your grandfather would be proud. The Pensacola Naval Air Station was transformed into a festival of American military aviation as the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition reached its crescendo. 50,000 spectators filled the viewing areas, their faces turned skyward in anticipation of the flying demonstrations that represented the pinnacle of pilot skill and aircraft performance. Food vendors and merchandise booths created a carnival atmosphere while children clutched toy airplanes and adults shared stories of their own military service. In the VIP viewing area, Admiral Marcus Rodriguez sat in the place of honor surrounded by congressional representatives, defense contractors, and international military attachés who had traveled from around the world to witness American aviation excellence. Rodriguez appeared relaxed and confident, the picture of a distinguished military leader celebrating the achievements of the service he had dedicated his life to defending. He had no idea that his victims were about to rise from the dead. The Blue Angels took off in perfect formation, their 6 A-18 Super Hornets climbing into the brilliant Florida sky with the kind of precision that made military aviation look effortless. Jake Thompson flew in the number 4 position, his aircraft maintaining perfect spacing with his squadron mates, while his mind raced through the plan that would either expose Rodriguez or result in court-martial charges that would destroy his career. As the Blue Angels began their demonstration routine, Jake's radio crackled with the voice he had been waiting to hear. "Blue Angels, this is Ghost Rider requesting permission to join your demonstration." The transmission came on an emergency frequency that only Blue Angels pilots were authorized to use, and the call sign Ghost Rider had belonged to Lieutenant Commander Catherine Sullivan during her time with the squadron. Jake felt his pulse accelerate as he realized that Catherine was airborne and beginning her approach to the demonstration area. The Blue Angels flight leader responded with professional calm. "Ghost Rider, you are not authorized in demonstration airspace. Please clear the area immediately." Jake keyed his radio before Catherine could respond. "Lead, this is Blue 4. Ghost Rider is authorized for a heritage demonstration flight. She's flying one of the restored P-51s from the museum collection." It was a lie, but it was a lie that would buy Catherine the time she needed to position herself for maximum visual impact. The flight leader hesitated clearly, unsure about an authorization he hadn't received through official channels. In that moment of hesitation, Catherine Sullivan announced her return to the world. The P-51 Mustang appeared from the east, like a silver thunderbolt, flying at an altitude and angle that placed it directly between the Blue Angels formation and the crowd of 50,000 spectators below. Catherine had timed her approach perfectly, arriving at the moment when all eyes were focused on the sky and all cameras were recording the demonstration. She began with a maneuver that had been her signature during her Blue Angels career, a knife-edge pass that brought the P-51 within 200 feet of the crowd, while flying sideways with the wings perpendicular to the ground. The maneuver required absolute precision and demonstrated a level of skill that couldn't be faked or duplicated. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. 50,000 people recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that transcended normal aviation demonstrations. The P-51's vintage lines and distinctive engine sound created a connection to aviation history that made the moment feel larger than entertainment. In the VIP viewing area, Admiral Rodriguez felt ice form in his stomach as he watched the silver fighter execute maneuvers that reminded him of someone he had destroyed 8 years earlier. Someone who was supposed to be dead. Catherine's voice filled the radio frequency broadcast live to military installations around the world and recorded by media outlets covering the demonstration. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lieutenant Commander Catherine Sullivan, United States Navy. 8 years ago, I was framed for treason by people who were actually guilty of the crimes they accused me of committing. Today, I'm here to expose the truth about corruption that has betrayed American military interests for decades." The words hit the crowd like a physical shock. Catherine Sullivan was supposed to be dead killed in an aircraft accident after being court-martialed for selling military secrets. Yet, here she was flying with the kind of skill that proved beyond doubt who she really was. Rodriguez reached for his secure communication device, his mind racing through options for containing a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. But before he could issue orders, Admiral Patterson's voice filled the same radio frequency that Catherine was using. "Admiral Rodriguez, this is Admiral Eleanor Patterson. I think it's time we had a conversation about Captain Michael Thompson, Lieutenant Commander Alexei Volkov, and the other people you've murdered to protect your conspiracy. The accusation was broadcast live to millions of listeners, recorded by international media, and transmitted to oversight committees that Rodriguez couldn't control or silence. Patterson had timed the revelation perfectly, ensuring that Rodriguez's crimes would be exposed in a forum that made cover-up impossible. Rodriguez's carefully maintained composure cracked as he realized that his victims had not only survived, but had spent years building an airtight case against him. Around him, congressional representatives and military attachés began demanding explanations for accusations that painted the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as a traitor and murderer. But Rodriguez had not survived 30 years of conspiracy by surrendering when challenged. He activated his command authority with the cold calculation of someone who had eliminated threats before and was prepared to do so again. All aircraft, this is Admiral Rodriguez speaking under emergency authority. He transmitted on the Blue Angels frequency. The aircraft identifying itself as Ghost Rider is stolen military property being operated by a known traitor. You are authorized to use all necessary force to prevent its escape. The order was transmitted live to the same audience that had heard Catherine's accusations, creating a public record of Rodriguez attempting to silence his accusers through violence. But it was also a direct command from the highest-ranking officer in the American military, and military pilots were trained to obey orders even when they disagreed with them. Jake Thompson found himself facing the moment that would define the rest of his life. He could follow Rodriguez's order and participate in the murder of the woman who had been seeking justice for his fathers, or he could disobey a direct command from his superior officer and risk court-martial for mutiny. He made his choice with the same courage that had defined both his fathers. Negative, Admiral, Jake transmitted on the open frequency. Ghost Rider is not a threat to military personnel or civilian spectators. I will not engage an unarmed heritage aircraft conducting a peaceful demonstration. The refusal to obey Rodriguez's order was heard by 50,000 spectators and broadcast to millions of listeners around the world. Jake Thompson had just committed career suicide to protect Catherine Sullivan, but he had also created a public record of military officers choosing honor over blind obedience. Rodriguez's fury was palpable as he realized that his authority was being challenged in the most public way possible. But he still had resources that Catherine and her allies couldn't match. F-16 fighters from nearby Eglin Air Force Base that could be scrambled to intercept the stolen aircraft. Eglin Control, this is Admiral Rodriguez with emergency authorization code Alpha 77. Scramble interceptors to engage hostile aircraft over Pensacola Naval Air Station. Target is a P-51 aircraft operating without authorization in restricted airspace. The scramble order would take several minutes to execute, but Rodriguez's interceptors would be faster and more heavily armed than Catherine's vintage fighter. If she remained in the demonstration area, she would be facing modern fighters with air-to-air missiles and pilots who might not hesitate to follow orders. Catherine understood the tactical situation as clearly as Rodriguez did. She had perhaps 5 minutes to complete her demonstration and present her evidence before facing interceptors that could shoot her down without difficulty. But 5 minutes was enough time to finish what she had started. She rolled the P-51 into a climbing turn that positioned her directly above the VIP viewing area, then began a demonstration of aerobatic flying that proved beyond any doubt that she was Catherine Sullivan. The signature maneuvers that had made her famous during her Blue Angels career, the Sullivan Spiral, the Pensacola Roll, the Gulf Coast Thunder, executed with a precision that couldn't be faked or duplicated. As she flew, Catherine's voice filled the radio frequency with a detailed account of Rodriguez's conspiracy supported by specific dates, financial records, and witness testimony, that Earl Washington and Admiral Patterson had spent 8 years documenting. The evidence was transmitted simultaneously to news organizations, congressional oversight committees, and international allies who could ensure that Rodriguez's crimes would be investigated regardless of his attempts at cover-up. Admiral Rodriguez has been using his military positions to facilitate weapons sales, technology transfers, and defense contract awards that have netted his network hundreds of millions of dollars, Catherine transmitted as she executed a perfect loop directly over the crowd. He murdered Captain Michael Thompson in 2016 when Thompson threatened to expose the conspiracy. He murdered Lieutenant Commander Alexei Volkov in 1991 when Volkov provided evidence of American officers selling secrets to foreign agents. Each accusation was specific, detailed, and supported by documentation that Rodriguez couldn't suppress or classify. Catherine was destroying his reputation and his conspiracy in the most public way possible, ensuring that the truth would survive even if she didn't. Rodriguez realized that his only remaining option was to eliminate Catherine before she could land safely and provide additional testimony to investigators. The interceptors from Eglin would arrive within minutes, but Catherine was already beginning her descent toward Pensacola's runway. All Blue Angels aircraft. This is Admiral Rodriguez, with direct orders. He transmitted with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. The traitor Catherine Sullivan is attempting to escape after stealing military property and compromising national security. You will intercept and destroy her aircraft before she can land. The order was heard by 50,000 spectators and broadcast to millions of listeners, creating an undeniable record of Rodriguez attempting to murder someone who was exposing his crimes. But it was also a direct command from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and military discipline demanded compliance regardless of personal feelings. Jake Thompson found himself facing the same choice that had defined his father's, whether to follow orders or follow conscience when the two came into conflict. Around him, his squadron mates struggled with the same decision, torn between military discipline and the growing realization that they were being ordered to commit murder. The moment stretched like eternity as 6 A-18 Super Hornets maintained formation, while their pilots grappled with an impossible choice. They were hearing evidence of decades-long conspiracy broadcast live to the world, but they were also receiving direct orders from their supreme commander. Jake broke the deadlock with words that would be remembered as long as military aviation existed. Blue Angels. This is Blue 4. I will not fire on an unarmed aircraft piloted by a woman seeking justice for murdered American servicemen. Anyone who wants to engage Ghost Rider will have to shoot me down first. The Blue Angels formation fractured as Jake Thompson broke away from his squadron, positioning his FA-18 Super Hornet between Catherine's P-51 and the other military aircraft in the demonstration area. His action created a tactical situation that had never been contemplated in military doctrine. Active-duty pilots choosing sides in a confrontation between justice and corruption at 30,000 feet above American soil. The crowd of 50,000 spectators watched in stunned silence as the carefully choreographed air show transformed into something unprecedented in American military history. Children who had come to see aviation excellence found themselves witnessing a public battle between honor and betrayal that would reshape their understanding of military service. Jake's squadron mates faced an impossible choice. They could follow Admiral Rodriguez's order to shoot down Catherine Sullivan, but doing so would require them to first eliminate Jake Thompson, a fellow pilot who was risking his career to protect someone seeking justice. Or they could refuse a direct order from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, effectively ending their military careers, while supporting what increasingly appeared to be the exposure of massive corruption. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Martinez, the Blue Angels' first female pilot since Catherine Sullivan, was the first to make her decision. She maneuvered her aircraft alongside Jake's, creating a protective formation around Catherine's vintage fighter. Blue 4. This is Blue 2, Martinez transmitted on the open frequency. I stand with Ghost Rider. No one shoots down an American hero on my watch. Her words were broadcast live to millions of listeners, creating another public record of military officers choosing conscience over blind obedience. Within seconds, the remaining Blue Angels pilots followed suit, their A-18s forming a protective diamond around Catherine's P-51 as she continued her descent toward Pensacola's runway. Admiral Rodriguez watched the defection of an entire Blue Angels squadron with the kind of cold fury that came from seeing carefully laid plans destroyed by people he had underestimated. For 30 years, he had controlled military personnel through a combination of authority, intimidation, and selective elimination of threats. Now, he was discovering that some people valued honor more than survival. But Rodriguez still had resources that Catherine's allies couldn't match. The F-16 interceptors from Eglin Air Force Base were approaching Pensacola at maximum speed, their pilots unaware of the political complexities surrounding their scramble order. To them, this was a straightforward intercept mission against unauthorized aircraft in restricted airspace. Eglin Strike, Package. This is Pensacola Control. Rodriguez transmitted using his command authority. You are cleared to engage all unauthorized aircraft in the demonstration area. Targets are considered hostile and are authorized for immediate destruction. The order was both illegal and treasonous. Rodriguez was commanding military pilots to attack other American servicemen who were exposing his crimes. But it was also an order from the highest-ranking officer in the American military, transmitted through official channels and supported by emergency authorization codes. Catherine heard the transmission and understood its implications. The F-16 interceptors would arrive within minutes, and their pilots would follow orders without understanding the context of their mission. She needed to complete her demonstration and land safely before facing fighters that were specifically designed for air-to-air combat. She rolled the P-51 into a steep diving turn that brought her aircraft within 100 feet of the runway, executing the kind of precision approach that had made her legendary during her Blue Angels career. Around her, Jake Thompson and his squadron mates maintained protective formation, their modern fighters creating a shield of American military power around the vintage aircraft that carried the truth about decades of corruption. But as Catherine lined up for her final approach, the F-16 interceptors appeared on the horizon like angry wasps, their afterburners creating contrails against the brilliant blue sky. 6 modern fighters against 6 Blue Angels, and 1 vintage P-51 odds that would normally favor the interceptors, but were complicated by the political ramifications of American pilots shooting down other American pilots in front of international media. The lead F-16 pilot established radio contact with Rodriguez, seeking confirmation of orders that seemed to violate every principle of military justice. Pensacola Control, this is Viper Lead requesting confirmation of engagement authorization. We have visual on multiple military aircraft, including what appears to be Blue Angels formation. Please confirm targets. Rodriguez's response carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Viper Lead, you are cleared to engage all aircraft protecting the stolen P-51. Authorization comes directly from Chairman of Joint Chiefs under emergency powers. The order was heard by 50,000 spectators and broadcast to millions of listeners, creating an undeniable record of Rodriguez commanding American pilots to attack other American servicemen. But it was also a direct order supported by proper authorization codes and military pilots were trained to follow orders even when they seemed morally questionable. Catherine realized that the F-16 interceptors were preparing to engage Jake's protective formation, potentially resulting in multiple American pilots being shot down by their own countrymen. She couldn't allow Jake Thompson and the Blue Angels to sacrifice their lives for her mission, regardless of the importance of exposing Rodriguez's conspiracy. She made the only decision her conscience would allow. "Blue Angels, this is Ghost Rider," Catherine transmitted on the open frequency. "Break formation and clear the area immediately. I will not be responsible for American pilots dying to protect me." Jake's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Negative, Ghost Rider. We're seeing this through to the end." The F-16 interceptors were now within missile range their pilots faced, with orders to engage fellow American servicemen who were protecting someone seeking justice. The lead pilot hesitated, recognizing that his actions would be recorded and judged by history. In that moment of hesitation, Admiral Patterson's voice filled the radio frequency with words that changed everything. "Viper, lead, this is Admiral Eleanor Patterson speaking under Congressional Authorization 77 Alpha. You are ordered to stand down immediately. The pilot you've been ordered to engage is an American hero exposing treason by Admiral Rodriguez. Any pilot who fires on Ghost Rider or the Blue Angels will be court-martialed for murder." Patterson's intervention was both legally questionable and tactically brilliant. Congressional Authorization 77 Alpha didn't actually exist, but it sounded official enough to create doubt in the minds of pilots who were already questioning their orders. More importantly, it provided them with an excuse to refuse orders that every instinct told them were wrong. The lead F-16 pilot made his decision with the same courage that had defined American military aviation since its inception. "Pensacola Control, this is Viper Lead. We are standing down pending clarification of conflicting orders. Will not engage American military personnel without clear legal authority." Rodriguez's fury was audible in his response. "Viper Lead, you are disobeying direct orders from your supreme commander. Return to base immediately and prepare for court-martial proceedings." But Rodriguez's authority was crumbling as rapidly as his conspiracy was being exposed. Congressional representatives in the VIP viewing area were demanding explanations for orders that appeared to constitute treason. International military attachés were reporting to their governments about American military leadership, ordering attacks on their own personnel. News organizations were broadcasting evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of American defense establishment. Catherine completed her landing approach with the kind of precision that had made her legendary, touching down on Pensacola's runway as 50,000 spectators erupted in applause that could be heard for miles. She had returned from the dead in the most public way possible, exposed decades of military corruption, and proven that some people valued truth more than personal safety. As her P-51 rolled to a stop, Catherine was surrounded by Blue Angels aircraft, whose pilots had risked their careers to protect her mission. Jake Thompson climbed down from his A-18 with an expression that mixed exhaustion with the satisfaction of someone who had finally honored his father's sacrifices. Admiral Rodriguez realized that his conspiracy was finished, his authority destroyed, and his freedom measured in hours rather than years. 30 years of carefully constructed corruption had been demolished in less than 30 minutes by people he had underestimated and victims he had assumed were safely dead. But Rodriguez had not survived decades of conspiracy by surrendering when faced with defeat. As congressional representatives and FBI agents began moving toward his position in the VIP viewing area, he activated the final contingency that he had hoped never to use. The explosion that destroyed the VIP viewing area was visible from 20 miles away, a fireball that eliminated dozens of witnesses and created chaos that Rodriguez hoped would allow him to escape justice one final time. But Rodriguez had underestimated the determination of people who had spent 8 years seeking justice for murdered friends and family members. As smoke and confusion filled the exhibition area, Admiral Patterson Earl Washington and Colonel Torres were already implementing security protocols that would ensure Rodriguez faced judgment for his crimes. The war between justice and corruption was entering its final phase, and this time, the good guys were going to win. The explosion that destroyed the VIP viewing area sent shockwaves through the crowd of 50,000 spectators, transforming the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition from a celebration of military aviation into a scene of chaos and terror. But as emergency responders rushed toward the burning wreckage and FBI agents began securing the area, Admiral Rodriguez discovered that his final gambit had failed to achieve its intended purpose. The bomb had been designed to eliminate key witnesses and create enough confusion to allow Rodriguez to escape, but Admiral Patterson and her allies had anticipated this possibility. Unknown to Rodriguez, they had moved critical congressional representatives and international military attachés to secure locations moments before the explosion, leaving only expendable subordinates and carefully placed decoys in the VIP area. Rodriguez himself had been evacuated from the viewing area by his personal security detail, who were actually FBI agents working under Patterson's direction. As the dust settled from the explosion, Rodriguez found himself in federal custody, surrounded by evidence of his crimes and facing charges that would ensure he spent his remaining years in federal prison. Catherine climbed down from her P-51 Mustang with legs that weren't entirely steady, the adrenaline of combat flying mixing with the emotional impact of finally revealing her true identity after 8 years of hiding. Around her, the Blue Angels pilots who had risked their careers to protect her mission were shutting down their aircraft with the kind of professional calm that masked profound personal satisfaction. Jake Thompson approached with an expression that mixed exhaustion with vindication. "Catherine, it's over. Rodriguez is in custody, and the evidence is being transmitted to oversight committees around the world." But Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since 2016, the sense that justice was finally within reach. What about his co-conspirators? What about the rest of the network? Earl Washington emerged from his mobile command center with a tablet displaying real-time intelligence feeds from around the world. FBI raids are beginning simultaneously at military installations, defense contractor facilities, and political offices in 12 states. Rodriguez's network is being rolled up as we speak. The scope of the operation was staggering. Admiral Patterson had spent 8 years not just documenting Rodriguez's conspiracy, but also coordinating with law enforcement agencies, congressional oversight committees, and international allies to ensure that justice would be comprehensive rather than symbolic. Dr. Rebecca Hayes approached with medical supplies and the kind of professional concern that came from someone who had spent decades treating combat veterans. "Catherine, you need to be checked for injuries before we proceed with debriefing. Adrenaline can mask serious medical conditions." Catherine submitted to the medical examination with professional patience, understanding that her physical condition would be scrutinized by investigators seeking to discredit her testimony. Dr. Hayes pronounced her fit for duty, clearing the way for the most important testimony she would ever provide. Admiral Patterson arrived with a convoy of vehicles that included congressional representatives, FBI investigators, and international military attachés who had been protected during Rodriguez's final attack. Her expression showed the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans had achieved complete success. "Catherine," Patterson said, "I need you to understand what we've accomplished today. Rodriguez's conspiracy has been operating for 30 years, corrupting American military leadership and betraying national security interests for profit. Today, we've exposed the entire network in a way that makes cover-up impossible. Patterson gestured toward the media vehicles that were arriving from around the world, their crews preparing to broadcast the biggest military corruption story in American history. Every major news organization, every congressional oversight committee, every international ally has received copies of our evidence. Rodriguez and his co-conspirators will face justice in forums they can't control or influence. Catherine felt the weight of 8 years' struggle lifting from her shoulders. What happens now? Patterson's smile was triumphant. Now you testify before Congress, provide evidence to federal prosecutors, and help ensure that the people who destroyed your career and killed good men face the consequences of their actions. Jake Thompson joined their conversation with obvious concern. What about legal protection? Rodriguez's network had resources for eliminating threats, and some of those resources might still be operational. Torres consulted his secure communication device. FBI has taken more than 200 people into custody in the past hour. Rodriguez's network is being systematically dismantled, but you're right to be concerned about remaining threats. Patterson nodded understanding. Catherine will have federal protection during the investigation and trial proceedings. After that, she'll have the protection that comes from being the most famous military corruption witness in American history. The irony was perfect. Catherine Sullivan had spent 8 years hiding from people who wanted her dead, and now her safety would depend on being as visible and famous as possible. Earl Washington approached with a folder containing documents that represented the culmination of his 60-year investigation into military corruption. Catherine, there's something you should see before the formal debriefing begins. He opened the folder to reveal a handwritten letter that bore the letterhead of the Secretary of Defense and was signed by officials whose authority superseded even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Presidential pardon for all actions taken in connection with exposing military corruption, Earl read aloud. Full restoration of military rank and privileges. Authorization to return to active duty at the discretion of the individual concerned. Catherine stared at the document that officially ended 8 years of exile and vindicated everything she had sacrificed for justice. How did you arrange this? Patterson's expression grew serious. Because the corruption you exposed reaches levels that threaten American national security. Because the president understands that people who risk everything to expose treason deserve recognition rather than punishment. Jake Thompson studied the pardon with obvious satisfaction. So Lieutenant Commander Catherine Sullivan is officially alive again. More than that, Patterson replied. Commander Catherine Sullivan with promotion recognition for 8 years of service that was interrupted by false accusations. The Navy owes you more than a pardon, Catherine. It owes you justice. As Catherine processed the implications of her official resurrection, she thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 8 years of hiding, of living under an assumed identity, while carrying the burden of truth alone. Today, she had not only exposed the conspiracy that had destroyed her career, but had also vindicated the sacrifices of Captain Thompson, Lieutenant Commander Volkov, and her grandfather, Jimmy Sullivan. The formal debriefing took place in a secure facility at Pensacola Naval Air Station, with congressional representatives, FBI investigators, and military prosecutors taking detailed testimony about decades of corruption that had betrayed American military interests. Catherine spoke for 6 hours, providing specific dates, financial records, and witness accounts that built an airtight case against Rodriguez and his co-conspirators. When the session ended, Catherine emerged to find Jake Thompson waiting with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal gratitude. "Commander Sullivan," he said, offering a crisp salute. "Thank you for giving me the chance to honor my father's sacrifices." Catherine returned the salute with emotion that she didn't try to hide. Thank you for having the courage to stand with me when it mattered most." Jake's smile was sad, but genuine. They would have been proud of what we accomplished today. Both of them. As evening fell over Pensacola Naval Air Station, Catherine stood beside her grandfather's P-51 Mustang and reflected on the legacy of courage that had shaped her family across 3 generations. Jimmy Sullivan had died fighting corruption during World War II. Captain Thompson had died trying to expose modern betrayal of military values. Today, their sacrifices had finally been vindicated by people who understood that some principles were worth dying for. Admiral Patterson approached with the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing justice finally served after decades of patient investigation. "Catherine, what are your plans now? The Navy would welcome you back with any assignment you choose. The Blue Angels would be honored to have you return as their commander." Catherine considered the question that would determine the rest of her life. She could return to the cockpit, could resume the military career that had been stolen from her 8 years earlier. Or she could choose the different path, one that honored the sacrifices of those who had died while building something new from the ashes of corruption. "I think I'll stay dead a little longer," Catherine said with a smile. "Sarah Mitchell built something important during the past 8 years. Maybe it's time to see what Catherine Sullivan can build with the truth, finally, on her side." Patterson nodded with understanding. "Whatever you choose, you'll have the support of people who know that courage like yours is rare and should be treasured." As night fell over the Gulf Coast, Catherine Sullivan stood beneath the stars that had guided aviators since the beginning of flight, finally free to be herself after 8 years of carefully constructed lies. Tomorrow would bring congressional testimony, federal trials, and the complex process of rebuilding a military culture that had been corrupted by decades of betrayal. But tonight, she was simply a pilot who had remembered how to fly like a hero. 6 months after the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition, Catherine Sullivan stood before the House Armed Services Committee in a hearing room packed with media representatives and military personnel who had traveled from around the world to witness the conclusion of the largest military corruption investigation in American history. The congressional hearing was being broadcast live to military installations globally, with simultaneous translation into 17 languages for international audiences who wanted to understand how American military leadership had been systematically corrupted for decades. Catherine wore her Navy dress blues with the restored rank insignia of commander, along with decorations that included the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and a newly created Congressional Medal for Extraordinary Service in exposing military corruption. But more important than any medal was the simple fact that she was alive, free, and finally able to tell the truth about events that had shaped American military history. Admiral Rodriguez sat at the defendant's table with the kind of rigid composure that came from someone who understood that his life was effectively over. 6 months of investigation had revealed the full scope of his conspiracy weapons sales that had armed America's enemies, technology transfers that had compromised national security, and defense contracts that had cost taxpayers billions of dollars while delivering inferior equipment to the military personnel who depended on it for their lives. The evidence against Rodriguez and his co-conspirators was overwhelming. Financial records showing hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal transactions, communication intercepts proving coordination with foreign agents, witness testimony from military personnel who had been intimidated into silence for decades. But perhaps most damning was Rodriguez's own recorded order to shoot down American military personnel who were exposing his crimes, an act of treason that had been broadcast live to millions of listeners and could never be denied or explained away. Congressman Michael Harrison, the committee chairman, called the hearing to order with the gravity appropriate to proceedings that would reshape American military culture. "Commander Sullivan," Harrison began, "your testimony has exposed corruption that reaches the highest levels of military leadership and has compromised American national security for decades. Before we proceed with recommendations for systemic reform, the committee would like your assessment of how such corruption was allowed to develop and persist." Catherine had spent months preparing for this question, consulting with historians, legal experts, and military scholars who understood the institutional factors that had enabled Rodriguez's conspiracy. Congressman Harrison, the corruption exposed during this investigation succeeded because it operated through legitimate channels and maintained strict compartmentalization. Catherine began. Most participants only knew their small piece of the operation, never seeing the full scope of what they were supporting. She gestured toward exhibits that showed organizational charts spanning multiple decades. But the fundamental enabler was a military culture that prioritized obedience over accountability, that discouraged questions about authority, and that punished people who reported wrongdoing rather than protecting them. The statement hit the hearing room like a physical force. Catherine was describing systemic problems that went beyond individual corruption to fundamental flaws in military institutional structure. "What specific reforms would you recommend to prevent similar corruption in the future?" asked Congresswoman Sarah Martinez, a former military prosecutor who understood the legal complexities involved. Catherine had anticipated this question and had developed recommendations based on her 8 years of observing military culture from outside its official hierarchy. First, independent oversight of military procurement and contracting with civilian auditors who can't be intimidated or transferred by military leadership, Catherine replied. Second, legal protection for military whistleblowers that includes financial support and career protection during investigation periods. She paused, organizing her thoughts for the most important recommendation. Third, a cultural shift that values moral courage as highly as physical courage, that teaches military personnel to question orders that violate their oath to defend the Constitution rather than follow authority blindly. The recommendations were radical by military standards, but they addressed the root causes that had enabled decades of corruption. Around the hearing room, military personnel and congressional representatives began to understand the scope of reform that would be necessary. Jake Thompson, now promoted to commander and serving as the new Blue Angels leader, provided testimony about the decision-making process that had led him to refuse Rodriguez's order to shoot down Catherine's aircraft. Congressman Harrison, military training teaches us to follow orders without question, Jake said. But our oath is to the Constitution, not to individual officers. When Admiral Rodriguez ordered us to attack fellow Americans who were exposing his crimes, that order violated everything the military is supposed to represent. Jake's testimony was powerful because it came from someone who had risked his career to make the right choice under extreme pressure. His example provided a model for future military personnel facing similar ethical dilemmas. Earl Washington, now officially recognized as a military intelligence specialist who had spent 60 years documenting corruption, provided historical context that showed how Rodriguez's conspiracy had evolved from similar corruption networks dating back to World War II. The conspiracy exposed by Commander Sullivan isn't an isolated incident, Earl testified. It's the latest evolution of systematic corruption that has been betraying American military interests for generations. Understanding this history is essential for preventing similar betrayals in the future. Admiral Patterson, testifying as both a witness and an expert on military intelligence operations, described the 8-year investigation that had built the case against Rodriguez. This investigation succeeded because it operated outside official channels that Rodriguez controlled, Patterson explained. It demonstrates the importance of independent oversight and the courage of individuals who are willing to sacrifice everything for truth. The congressional hearings continued for 3 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and presentation of evidence that filled thousands of pages of official record. When they concluded, the committee issued recommendations that would fundamentally reshape American military culture and oversight procedures. But perhaps more important than official reforms was the cultural impact of Catherine Sullivan's story. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for truth, combined with Jake Thompson's courage in refusing illegal orders, created examples that would influence military personnel for generations. Military academies added new courses on ethical decision-making that used Catherine's case study as a primary example. The story of the Blue Angels pilots who chose conscience over blind obedience became required reading for officer candidates. Museums displayed exhibits about the importance of moral courage in military service. 6 months after her dramatic return from the dead, Catherine faced the question that would determine the rest of her life. The Navy had offered her any assignment she wanted, including command of the Blue Angels or promotion to flag rank. Defense contractors had offered lucrative consulting positions that would have made her financially secure for life. Instead, she chose to establish the Sullivan Institute for Military Ethics, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting military whistleblowers and promoting the kind of moral courage that she had demonstrated during her 8-year struggle for justice. The Institute's mission statement reflected the lessons learned from her experience. Military personnel who expose corruption and betrayal of American values deserve protection and support, not persecution and exile. The courage to question authority when authority violates constitutional principles is as important as the courage to face enemy fire. Jake Thompson accepted appointment as the Institute's first director of military outreach, working to build relationships with military personnel who might face ethical dilemmas similar to those that had defined his and Catherine's careers. Earl Washington continued his work documenting military corruption, but now with official recognition and institutional support that allowed him to operate openly rather than from abandoned gas stations and secret facilities. Dr. Rebecca Hayes established medical support programs for military personnel who faced retaliation for reporting wrongdoing, recognizing that the stress of fighting institutional corruption could have serious health consequences. Admiral Patterson returned to official retirement, but with the satisfaction of knowing that her decades of service had culminated in exposing the largest military corruption conspiracy in American history. As Catherine stood in the offices of the Sullivan Institute 1 year after the Gulf Coast Thunder exhibition, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from exile and assumed death to recognition as one of the most important military corruption witnesses in American history. The walls of her office displayed photographs that told the story of her family's multi-generational commitment to military service and moral courage. Her grandfather, Jimmy Sullivan, in his Tuskegee Airmen uniform, Captain Thompson and Lieutenant Commander Volkoff, during their service together, Jake Thompson receiving his promotion to commander. But the most important photograph showed Catherine herself, climbing down from her P-51 Mustang after landing at Pensacola surrounded by Blue Angels pilots who had risked their careers to protect her mission. It was the moment when 8 years of hiding had ended, and the truth had finally been revealed. A knock on her office door interrupted her reflection. Jake Thompson entered with a secure communication device and the kind of expression that suggested important news. "Commander Sullivan," he said with formal courtesy that masked deep personal affection. "We've received a request for assistance from a Navy intelligence specialist who believes she's uncovered evidence of weapons smuggling involving senior officers at Pacific Command." Catherine felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that came with new investigations. The Sullivan Institute had been operational for only 6 months, but they had already received dozens of requests for assistance from military personnel who had discovered corruption and needed support to expose it safely. "What kind of assistance is she requesting?" Catherine asked. Jake consulted his notes. "Legal protection, financial support during investigation period, and expertise in building cases that can't be suppressed or classified by the people being investigated." Catherine smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling. "Tell her she has our full support, and Jake, yes, ma'am. Remind her that courage like hers is what makes the military worth defending. She's not alone anymore." As Jake departed to coordinate support for another military whistleblower, Catherine returned to her reflection on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 8 years of exile had taught her that justice delayed was not justice denied, as long as people had the courage to keep fighting for truth. The conspiracy that had destroyed her career and killed good men had finally been exposed, but the work of building a military culture that valued moral courage was just beginning. Every day brought new challenges, new investigations, new opportunities to support people who were willing to risk everything for justice. Catherine Sullivan had returned from the dead to expose corruption that had betrayed American military values for decades. Now she was building something that would ensure such betrayals became impossible in the future. The ghost pilot of Pensacola had finally found her way home. Epilogue. 10 years later, the dedication ceremony for the captain. Michael Thompson Memorial at Pensacola Naval Air Station took place on a brilliant spring morning that reminded everyone present of the day Catherine Sullivan had returned from the dead to expose military corruption that had betrayed American values for decades. Catherine, now retired from active duty, but serving as director of the Sullivan Institute for Military Ethics, stood beside Jake Thompson as he unveiled the memorial that honored his adoptive father's sacrifice. The memorial included the names of dozens of military personnel who had been killed or destroyed for attempting to expose corruption, including Lieutenant Commander Alexei Volkov and Captain Jimmy Sullivan. The ceremony was attended by military personnel from around the world. Congressional representatives who had implemented the reforms recommended by Catherine's investigation and investigative journalists who continued to expose corruption wherever they found it. But perhaps most important were the young military officers who had been inspired by Catherine's example to choose moral courage over blind obedience when facing ethical dilemmas in their own careers. The Sullivan Institute had supported more than 300 military whistleblower cases exposing corruption networks that reached into every branch of the armed services. Admiral Rodriguez had died in federal prison 2 years earlier, unrepentant to the end, but finally held accountable for decades of betraying the military personnel he had sworn to lead. His death closed a chapter in American military history, but the reforms inspired by his exposure would influence military culture for generations. As Catherine spoke at the memorial dedication, she reflected on the lessons learned from a decade of fighting for military justice. The courage to expose corruption and betrayal of American values is not optional for military personnel, she said to the assembled crowd. It is a fundamental requirement of our oath to defend the Constitution. When we see wrongdoing, we have a moral obligation to act regardless of personal cost. She paused, looking out at faces that included some of the bravest people she had ever known. Military personnel who had risked everything to expose corruption, investigators who had built cases that sent criminals to prison, reformers who had changed institutional culture that had enabled decades of betrayal. 10 years ago, I thought my career was over when I discovered evidence of weapons smuggling and technology transfers that betrayed American national security. Today, I understand that my real career began when I chose truth over safety, justice over silence. Catherine's words were broadcast live to military installations around the world, where young officers learned about the importance of moral courage from someone who had demonstrated it at the highest possible cost. After the ceremony, Catherine walked among the memorial stones with Jake Thompson, reading names that represented decades of sacrifice for justice. "Do you think we've changed anything that matters?" Jake asked quietly. Catherine considered the question that had driven her work for the past decade. Around them, young military personnel discussed ethical dilemmas with the kind of sophistication that had been impossible before the reforms inspired by her investigation. Military academies taught courses on moral courage that used her case as a primary example. Whistleblower protection programs provided support that made exposure of corruption possible without career suicide. "I think we've proven that some people are willing to sacrifice everything for truth," Catherine replied. "And I think that example will inspire others to make the same choice when their moment comes." Jake nodded with satisfaction. "My fathers would be proud of what we've accomplished." Catherine smiled as she thought about the men who had died trying to expose the same corruption that she had finally brought to light. "I think they'd be proud that their sacrifices finally meant something." As the sun set over Pensacola Naval Air Station, Catherine Sullivan stood beneath the same stars that had guided aviators since the beginning of flight, finally at peace with a life that had been shaped by betrayal, exile, justice, and redemption. She had been the ghost pilot of Pensacola, the woman who had died to expose truth and lived to build something better from the ashes of corruption. Her legacy would endure as long as military personnel understood that moral courage was as important as physical bravery in defending American values. The sky that had once been her prison had become her salvation, and the truth that had once destroyed her life had finally set her free.